All right, I think it is that time. So I will call us back to order, and we will start with a roll call. So, Councillor Walters? Okay, we'll hook back around to him in a sec. Councillor Banga? Maybe we're not starting yet. Councillor Hamilton?
I'm here. Hello.
Oh, good, great. I was beginning to think that that something had gone wrong with our technology. Councillor McKean?
For the record, Mr. Chair, my head hurts, but I am here.
It's good. It's good exercise for your brain. Councillor Paquette?
Thank you.
I'm here. Hello.
Good. All right. So we do have quorum. I'll just check back. Councillor Walters? Or Councillor Banga? All right. Well, we'll get going without them and hopefully... Oh,
I am.
Oh, Councillor Banga's here. And Councillor Walters, did I hear you as well? Okay. Well, hopefully he'll join us shortly. All right. We will go now to our speakers, which is a treat at Utility Committee. We don't usually get speakers. So I will go first. We'll hear from both speakers together. Just as a heads up, actually, I don't have all my sort of rules of engagement here in terms of this, but I know, Ms. Samji, I know you have appeared before. Ms. Lawrence, for your sake, you will have 5 minutes. So we'll hear from both of you. Each of you will have 5 minutes. And then once we've heard from both speakers, committee will have a chance to ask you questions. So, Ms. Lawrence, I'm presuming, I didn't check to make sure, Ms. Samji, I can see you, so I presume that we'll be able to hear you when we get there. Ms. Lawrence, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Perfect, and we can hear you well. So the next 5 minutes are yours.
Okay, so I'm here today to talk about stormwater and how it relates to, there we are, to mature neighborhoods. Next slide, please. Urban flooding will be one of the top issues facing municipalities over the next few years due to climate change. It is the responsibility of the municipal government to ensure all new developments within its jurisdiction do not cause overland flooding to neighboring properties due to stormwater runoff. The citizens of Edmonton need City Council to take the necessary steps to prevent overland flooding in mature neighborhoods. Next slide, please. So this is a great picture. It's used by around, everybody uses this picture to show what the impact is to additional runoff. And that's going to existing stormwater infrastructure. Next slide, please. So my recommendations are three different ones under 3 categories: fairness, enforcement, and transparency. Next slide, please. Under fairness, the first one, utility rates and applicable charges to customer classes should reflect the cost of providing the essential service with minimal subsidization. The next point is, it is the responsibility of the utility regulator, Edmonton City Council, to ensure that EPCOR customers are being charged fairly and equitably for the services they receive. Next slide, please. Under fairness, we've got the stormwater utility charge for RF1 customers. They include area times intensity factor times the runoff coefficient times the rate. A stands for the area of the property in meters squared. I is the intensity factor, which is always 1. The runoff coefficient currently used is 0.5 times the rate. Infill homes and garages are larger in size with less permeable ground, creating more surface runoff compared to previous homes and garages with existing stormwater infrastructure. A conservative estimate of runoff volume that is commonly used correlates to a 1-to-1 ratio. Simply speaking, for every 1% increase in surface area, there's a 1% increase in runoff volume. A conservative change in surface area from an existing or older home, say approximately 1,000 square feet, to an infill home of say 1,200 to 1,300 would be approximately 28%, which is based on a 1-to-1 ratio, which would increase runoff by 28%. My recommendation: increase the R coefficient for new and existing infill properties from 0.5 to 0.65. This change in R value is fair to all residential customers and represents more of a user-paid charge. Although the change in R value is very conservative, it will help offset the cost to replace and upgrade the existing stormwater infrastructure, which should allow for implementation effective January 1st, 2022. Next slide, please. Also under fairness, we've got when construction projects tend to contribute a lot of debris to catch basins, my recommendation: charge an environmental levy to contractors to offset the cost of maintaining maintaining stormwater drains. This could be implemented January 1st, 2022. The second point, when water main breaks are caused by problems with construction, improper work, this recommendation would be to have those costs be charged back to the contractor or company rather than the ratepayers. These changes could be implemented again for January 1st, 2022. Next slide, please. Enforcement. The first step to mitigating overland flooding in mature neighborhoods is the approved lot grading of infill properties to ensure stormwater runoff reaches stormwater drains. Recommendation. The City of Edmonton lot grading bylaw must be enforced to all new and existing infill properties effective immediately. Failure to enforce the lot grading bylaw will result in overland flooding, which causes damage to both private and public property. This raises property insurance rates and property taxes and could lead to a class action lawsuit against the city. Recommendation. The City of Edmonton must provide the necessary support to both the employees of EPCOR and the City of Edmonton to ensure compliance through supporting enforcement to everyone and implementing stronger enforcement rules effective January 1st, 2022. In other municipalities, fines of $10,000 for non-compliance, and also in other jurisdictions, caveats are placed on the land title certificate until compliance is met. Next slide, please. So this was a great picture. It's courtesy of City of Calgary. I apologize, but it shows a great proper lot grading. And the next picture again, next slide. Next slide. This is one from the City of Medicine Hat, again showing proper lot grading to ensure that the surface runoff actually goes to the roadways and goes down the storm drain. Next slide, please. Transparency. Research compiled for this presentation uncovered 2 infill properties on the same street built in 2014 and 2015 respectively had not yet received lot grading approval. This represented approximately 20% of the infill properties on that street. FOIP requests regarding this matter were submitted to the Corporate Access and Privacy Office with the City of Edmonton in November of 2020. Responses were received 6 months later in May of 2021, with both came back completely redacted. The citizens, taxpayers of Edmonton deserve better. Recommendation. Allow the release of lot grading status and related information to surrounding homeowners, community members, and potential home buyers without having to go through a FOIP request. Lot grading should not be a privacy issue. The city should post all outstanding non-compliance issues on Edmonton Slim Maps until
Excuse
compliance
me,
is met.
Mr. Chair, the time is up. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't have the time in front of me, but we've gone past 5 minutes, so thanks. I think you got through most of it, and I know we had your submission already, so there may be questions on that. So thank you, Ms. Sanji.
Good afternoon, Utility Committee. I think for all the times that I've spoken in front of members today, I don't know if I've ever spoken in front of Utility Committee. So this morning I sent a letter to you talking about the successes and effect of the pilot program for the cost share program. So I won't go into the details of it now. However, I wanted to say thank you. In 2018, IDEA came to Urban Planning Committee to share why missing middle projects weren't going forward. And these are the exact projects that communities were asking for. As of now, as we know now, it is because the fire protection standards have changed and the majority of Edmonton's mature neighborhoods have deficient water main coverage for fire protection for existing developments, let alone the beautiful projects we're looking to build. At the time, we didn't know the average costs, what the demand was, or where projects were going to be built. However, now we know that there is considerable demand because there was 34 projects that came forward in a 2-year span, with the average cost of upgrades being $360,000. We were only able to learn this because of the pilot program that Council approved. Thank you for funding the incredibly important pilot that gave us 7 new projects and critical data that we needed. We also want to note that the upgrades that happened for the 7 projects positively affected everyone on the block, not just a site-specific project, and it gets everyone to the fire protection that they need. I also want to say a huge thank you to Betty Ikra and her team at EPCOR, Kelly Sizer and her team at the City of Edmonton, Cameron Bardez and Kale Griswold from Fire Protection, and so many others because of their knowledge and expertise that helped us build the pilot, this innovative program which became one of the first that's focused on infill. I cannot overstate the value of this program enough. Other styles of development have financial programs that help work to develop our city. However, infill does not have similar programs. Today, I am asking for you to make this a funded program instead of a pilot. It will help us achieve city plan goals. It will help create a safer environment for our neighborhoods. And I believe it will be the catalyst for other programs similar to this. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for the support to date.
Thank you very much. So, questions from committee? And do we have anybody? See you in a sec. Sorry, I'm not seeing a list yet.
We have Councillor McKean on
Councillor
the list.
McKean, off you go.
Samji, thank you for your presentation. I was looking for the program inside the PBR, and you're here to tell us it's not in the PBR.
It is in the PBR.
Okay, is that the $20 million?
That is the $20 million.
Okay, yeah, I thought
If
it
you want to
was.
give it more, we're fine with that. But
Well, that's maybe a good start. I'm trying to remember how much was in the pilot. Do you remember? Well, how many?
yes, so it was $2.4 million over 2
Okay.
years.
Yeah, and was oversubscribed.
Yes, substantially.
Okay. So what I'll ask EPCOR is if their 20 million is oversubscribed, if there's a way to come back to council for an adjustment to rates to reflect that. But I don't know if I have any more questions for you then. Thank you very much for being here today, Mariah.
Thank you so much for all your support on this.
Cheryl, just a little bit about why you brought this forward today. You and I have never met. I don't know if you're representing somebody or just yourself.
You know, it started, my background is electrical rate design and rate regulation. And I've always said, I've always been on the other end of it, like with it, I'd be on the EPCOR side of it. And I've always said to people, look at your bill. So I looked at my EPCOR water bill, and I was surprised by the R coefficient. And so I started asking questions, talking to rates people with EPCOR and just doing some investigation, and realized that with climate change, this is very important. And I don't believe in subsidizing with rates. I'm the first person to ever develop cost-based rates in North America. And I believe that everybody should be paying their fair share, and that there should not be cross-subsidization when it comes to rates, especially going forward in these 5 years with its economic outlook. So that's kind of where I started from. And then as I got closer, I realized in talking to a number of people, a lot of civil engineers and environmental engineering professors, that said, you know what, this is so important, but lot grading is the key. You have to do lot grading. It has to be, because that's where the water needs to go. It needs to go down the storm drain. If we have these freak storms with climate change, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, so we would need to know as a municipality which lots are not in compliance. That would be the first step, it would seem to me.
Absolutely.
And then your next suggestions were around enforcement.
Yes.
And even transparency, putting a list out of lots that are not in compliance. Do I have that right?
Absolutely. Yes. It is so key to, and it shouldn't be a privacy issue. We should all know, because it affects your property, and it affects all of our insurance rates when properties flood. And this will if it affects public property, it affects our property taxes. And if it's your bylaw, enforce it.
Yeah, I'm not sure, I'm not clear on exactly how this fits into our PBR discussion today, but I will undertake to at least find that out.
Okay.
Or if we need subsequent reports on this that would come back later. But I appreciate not only your research and testimony today, but at the speed at which you did it was remarkable.
I had to cut a lot out so that I could get as much in as possible. But I was having a lot of difficulty finding out the information through the city, and FOIP requests turn up redacted, and there's a complaint now with the Privacy Commissioner of Alberta with those two FOIP requests, and they said that it will take years because there are so many city complaint or FOIP requests that have gone through the city that turn up redacted, and this is unacceptable in my opinion. We need transparency. We need to know what's happening. And I think this is important in all areas, but especially with lot grading. It isn't about planting flowers in a park or putting a bench. This is lot grading. This impacts and this causes damage to other people's property.
Yeah, no, I hear you, and I really appreciate your testimony today. So thanks for coming out.
Thank you.
Councillor Banga.
Thank you. Miss, I'm just going to go with Cheryl.
Thank you.
No problem. Anyway, my question to you is, when you say the damage to other property, and I know a few examples of this, are you talking about grading of the lots before approval, or are you talking about people making changes to their lots?
I'm talking about approval of infill properties that actually don't have approval, and that, for whatever reason, they were not, not been enforced.
So you mean when a new infill project is done, they are not subjected to these things?
From what I was able to find, 20% of what I found did not have approval. And like I say, it's very difficult to get information about more numbers, but for what I could find, 20%, and to me, that's unacceptable. Because I'm not a civil engineer. Most people aren't civil engineers. We don't know who has lot grading approval. Your bylaw is very well written compared to other municipalities. Your bylaw, lot grading bylaw, is so well written. It would be great if it would be enforced. But I think part of it could be that it just doesn't have, maybe, a stronger, right now it's a fine, I think, of $1,000, which is, in a lot of cases could represent a fee rather than a fine. So other municipalities ensuring the enforcement have raised it to $10,000, and we're putting caveat because they consider this very, very important moving forward. And you can't stop someone from moving into a property in Edmonton if they don't have lot grading. And I think that that's wrong. I think that should have approval before the keys are, given to the developer or however it works. But you should not be able to have approval for that property without having lot grading.
Okay. So you mentioned other jurisdictions.
Yes.
And you have any idea or indication that the fines have increased the compliance rate?
It was sort of a mixed thing, and the one with the caveat, that seemed to work very, very well, because it doesn't go away. It sits, like if you go to sell your property, it sits right there on your land title certificate. The caveat will show non-compliance. So that seemed to have a more of an impact than but the 10,000 fine. It's difficult to say. They seem to have better compliance than we did. That's all I can say. It's hard to know exactly without comparing, property to property, I guess.
Okay. And then you also raised that these infill projects EPCO should be charging those folks for the plugged drainage or whatever the case may be.
Well, with regards to the infill property, they should be paying a higher runoff rate than say, mature homes, because typically what happens is the homes are larger and there's more concrete than opposed to, say, the older homes that may have gardens and this sort of thing. So what I'm recommending, and it's a very conservative rate, and the 0.65 over the 0.5, and it's not going to make a big difference. It makes about a $5 difference on their bill, but it will. That money, that stormwater charge, goes directly to replacing the stormwater infrastructure, and that's what's so important, is that it's going to have to be replaced sooner rather than later because of the infill properties that are now going into mature neighborhoods. So we need to be prepared for that, and it's going to, in a lot of cases in mature neighborhoods where they've already done the new sidewalks, this is going to be another hit to them.
Okay, so by increasing the runoff factor to 0.65, you mean to say that on a particular lot of this type, 65% of the water immediately goes down to the storm water?
I'll tell you, it's kind of funny about the 0.65 because in theory, the number should be between 0.3 and 0.5. That's typically what you use for this type of equation. This is like if you look on the internet and you do your research. EPCOR chose 0.5 for all residential. You know, I don't know if they should use 0.3 and then use 0.5 for infill, but the 0.5 is really just a number, and you can't really think of percentages. It's just a matter of increasing that amount. If you want to have a different number in there, you could, but it's just because the R coefficient's already there, I'm talking about increasing it just slightly by 28% to ensure that the individuals that are causing the stormwater infrastructure to be having to be replaced sooner pay for that, rather than all the residential customers, rather than them subsidizing the infill properties.
Thank you. I'm way over time.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. I'm not seeing anybody else, so I'll ask some questions. Ms. Lawrence,
Yes.
I'm interested in that because I actually do think there's something we need to look at, and I think EPCOR in their response to you, their written response, recognized it, on how we deal with this question of lot coverage and I suppose permeability on the lot as part of our rate setting exercise. I'm a little bit nervous about doing it on the fly without actually looking at it, because it seems to me, I think there's a really valid question here about if we're charging, and if I understand your point, which I think is completely valid, that it's how much of a lot is still pervious and how much is impervious should affect your rates. But I'm wondering if that's, being able to measure that, being able to measure lot coverage with what's concrete, what's a building, what's grass, and being able to put that into the formula would be a fair way of dealing with it than guessing that that infill projects are using more of their land. Thoughts about that?
Sorry.
Yeah, no, just I'd be interested on your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's an interesting sort of discussion to have, and I know EPCOR brought it up. I think the other option is, and other municipalities put this, talk about this, and I mentioned this in my submission, is in other jurisdictions, when you put in your development permit to change what is existing to what you're planning to do, they look at the additional runoff because they could tell how much bigger the house is, how much, where the patio is going to be, that kind of thing. And at that point, there's a decision that's made. And in some cases, they make, rather than, an R coefficient or a rate, they actually take that additional, if it's 100 square feet of additional surface area from your roof, that water has to go to an underground reverse sump in your yard, rather than going to the storm, because they know the cost of replacing stormwater infrastructure is so expensive that they don't want everybody else to have to pay for it. So if you're causing additional, amount, then you should have to get rid of your own water essentially. And some people, in places they put it underground and they use it for irrigation.
There, it's interesting there because there are two different pieces to this puzzle. One of which I think would not necessarily be dealt with through these bylaws, and the lot drainage. I mean, absolutely, we need to control that, and I think, and I suspect EPCOR would have interest in that conversation and discussion going forward. But it's not really necessarily part of the PBR bylaws. But the question of the rate piece should be or could be. But I'm just a little bit nervous about doing it on the fly. by assuming something with new builds that may not necessarily be true. Anyway, I wanted you to explore. The one other thing I wanted to check with you, which actually probably is outside of the PBR as well, but I think is an interesting discussion, is one of the interesting things on our lot drainage is, I think what's becoming apparent is a lot of our older building stock is not playing by the lot drainage rules. We didn't pay attention to that then. They may well be draining onto their neighbors. They may be draining in ways, and that's part of what's creating some of the grief around this. So I'd be interested in proposing that we might want to have a look at the lot drainage question, whether or not you're only suggesting we do it for new builds, or whether we should be going back and having a look at this. I mean, I think it's a really problematic thing probably to go back. It would create lots of grief, but I'm wondering if there's a fairness issue there. I mean, I think we certainly need, our rule, as you point out, is pretty strict about what new builds have to do. But I'm wondering your thoughts on existing properties that may not be meeting our new standards.
I think that if you don't go after the existing properties, you set the wrong sort of trend going forward. Because if another person builds side next door to that and they follow what they've done,
Yep.
what I've often heard from people is, well, he did it, I'm going to do it too.
Yep.
He
No,
built
I
this
hear
way,
ya.
so I'm going to do it. So I think that there can't be exceptions. There can't be the friends and family rule. It has to be that everybody follows it, because it's so important, especially because of overland flooding and the fact that climate change is going to be very prevalent coming up.
Yeah, good.
And
Well, I mean, I think those are interesting points. We do have people listening from our planning department today, and I think that's probably maybe something that they should be looking at. It's probably not in purview today of the PBR, but the right people are listening. So, thank you.
thank you.
So I'm not seeing any other questions of the speakers. So at this point, thank you very much to both of our speakers. It was helpful to have your added input. I think now we go back to Mr. Beckett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to direct my questions to EPCOR, but I'm not sure who in EPCOR will respond to them, so I'll let EPCOR make that call as they go. The first thing I'd like to do is review the discussion on page 4 of EPCOR's response document dealing with business risks and proposed return on equity. The first business risk that is identified is the fact that water is a consumable product with health and environmental regulations. And my question to EPCOR is, do you do a risk-based assessment of the capital and operating and maintenance expenses associated with avoiding health and environmental problems?
I'll take the first response to that. We certainly look at upcoming regulations and try to plan for those. And the PBR does contain anything that we know in terms of changes in regulation. The challenge often is regulations change between terms, and that's ultimately where the risk comes in.
But how is that a risk if you have the opportunity to make a non-routine adjustment?
The non-routine adjustment has a $500,000 financial threshold. And if you look at that on a pure capital basis, that typically is $15, $17 to $23 million, depending on the depreciation of the asset you're installing. And so any change that requires an expenditure below that level is paid for by EPCOR. So the risk of that is borne with us.
But I get a sense from reading this particular section that EPCOR is concerned that the regulator may not approve appropriate expenses associated with complying with health and environmental regulations.
I wouldn't interpret it that way. I apologize if it conveys that, but no, I don't think we've ever had any issues with council not approving anything to do with health regulations. Again, it's ones that happen between the PBR terms that we're obligated to put into place, but we really have no opportunity to reflect those costs and rates. So those are borne by EWSI.
Well, you do have an opportunity when it comes time to rebase.
That's correct.
The second point you make is that the contributed assets is materially higher than other utilities. So you are expected to operate, maintain, and if necessary, improve those assets over time. Is that correct?
That's correct. We make no differentiation between a contributed asset and an asset that we've funded.
And the regulator has approved your forecast for those expenditures?
That's correct.
Okay. Again, you talk about the longer period over which utility capital is recovered. That was the third item.
Yes.
And again, I ask you, have you had or do you foresee any difficulty in obtaining approval from the regulator to expend the necessary operating, maintenance, and capital improvement dollars for these longer-lived assets?
No, but there is still greater risk of failure as the asset ages. And so longer term assets tend to fail more frequently. And so, again, assets that we know of and we can put into the PBR, we get certain recovery of those. The risk stems from the fact that in between PBRs, that risk is borne by us unless it meets the non-routine adjustment criteria. And typically asset failure would not, because it has to be outside our control. So in those situations, we have to demonstrate that we were not prudent in managing those assets.
So if it is within your control, and you use a risk-based assessment to determine how to treat those assets, how is that different?
Well, I guess the risk-based approach is not perfect. And there is a difference in terms of the quality of the assets between the three utilities. And I think, as we've noted a couple times in our presentations today, as well as some of the PBR material, the drainage assets are probably in the worst shape of the three, and access to do inspections on those is very limited. So our knowledge is not as good as we had hoped it to be in the future, and so there's certainly more risk with that.
And your final point is has to do with the fixed versus variable revenue charges. You point out that the average percentage of your revenues from fixed charges is only 31.3%. And I guess my question to you is, why is that? Why isn't it much higher?
The main reason is because we want to incent conservation. That's one of the goals that we believe in, and certainly Utility Committee has informed to us that it's something we should be pursuing. And so if you have a high percentage of fixed assets, then the incentive to conserve is much less. And we also do a number of reviews of what other jurisdictions are doing, and what we're seeing is that those with very high fixed are in fact going to more towards variable just to drive conservation.
So would you agree with me if I said that the most efficient outcomes occur when pricing closely matches the incremental cost of providing the service?
I think that's a fair statement, but there's also conflicting desires. And so are we talking about revenue stability for the utility, or are we talking about overall conservation of water? And in many respects, those are contradictory.
Are you of the opinion that only rate design can cause conservation?
No. We do have conservation programs that we've put in place for a number of years. And it comes down to customer awareness. We have rain barrel programs. So we have a number of other initiatives that we also pursue in order to incent conservation with ratepayers.
So how do you balance the difference between, or which method to use to incent conservation rates versus those other programs?
I think the reality is the others are quite small in comparison to a price signal, because that is the standard method in all of society of incenting consumption or not, is through the price. And so we do have the tiered rate structure as well, in order to let people know who consume more that they will in fact pay more.
Are you aware of utilities that participate in conservation programs through investments in customer properties?
At a very high level,
But you're aware that that does happen?
yes.
Okay. So now turning to the rate of return, again on page 4 of your report, you indicate that your approach hinges on the AUC's generic cost of capital, which is in accordance with the Utilities Committee's direction in the last PBR proceeding to determine a return on equity for EWSI based on the generic cost of capital plus a risk premium. My recollection is that the direction of the Utility Committee was to determine a rate of return based on using the AUC's generic cost of capital as a starting point. I don't recall there being a specific direction to use the risk premium approach. Is that your recollection?
Yeah, I guess I'm interpreting those as much the same, but certainly starting with the AUC as the basis was our understanding of the direction.
Good. So I assume because you reference it in your report that you're familiar with decision, AUC decision 2011-474?
Some of it, yes, it's a long decision.
Yes, it is a long decision. So would you agree with me if I summarize that long decision by saying that the AUC determined that the rate of return for utilities should be the same for all utilities, and that risk should be managed by looking at equity thickness and mitigative regulatory measures? There is no provision in the generic cost of capital decision for a risk premium.
Yeah, that's my understanding of their approach to determining an ROE.
So when EPCOR decided to file this application, why is it that you only focused on the risk premium and didn't look at these other methods that the AUC had identified?
I think the process that we went through, and we started working with administration, was trying to quantify the risk premium based on the motion as we understood it from Utility Committee. And, you know, I think there's probably a lot of different ways we could have approached this, but again, we felt that the turmoil in the market did not allow a lot of the traditional methods to be looked at, so we wanted to do something that we saw as very straightforward and probably balanced simplicity with the financial metrics that we could achieve given where the markets were at.
But didn't you determine fairly early on that that was a problematic approach when you couldn't find a consultant who would help you calculate that risk premium?
Well, I think the problem in the approach comes down to trying to parse out a risk premium into its component parts. And so, for example, if you're trying to say what impact does contributed assets have to the overall risk premium, or what impact does a fixed rate structure versus a variable rate structure have to the risk premium, the whole concept of a risk premium is something that you normally back into as opposed to something that you build up from its individual components. And so we did look at a number of consulting companies to pursue this in conjunction with administration. And most said, well, this is not a traditional approach. And we really couldn't find anyone who was prepared to pursue it and ultimately deliver what we felt the Utility Committee was looking for.
And just to add to that, our approach in this PBR hinges on the Grant Thornton review for the 2017 to 21 period. And in that review, they did indicate they accepted the 60-40% capital structure, and they advised a risk premium above the generic cost of capital, which we've deducted from their recommended cost of capital. So we're hinging our proposal consistent with that, and that's why we retain the debt equity ratios as we've proposed in this PBR.
Well, it probably makes sense to retain those, the debt to equity ratio, since your ratio is higher than any of the utilities regulated by the AUC, which reflects additional risk. Okay, I'm moving on now to page 9 of your report. In there you say that EWSI has not requested the use of any deferral accounts in the history of the PBR, nor is it requesting a consumption deferral account at this time. I was surprised by that statement because, to my knowledge, there is an existing deferral account. Bylaws 17698 and 18100 establish the drainage adjustment deferral account. It may never have been accumulated any balances, but it does exist, wouldn't you agree?
I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with that. Was that pre-transfer to EPCOR?
No, this is in the PBR bylaws. The section on the non-routine adjustments includes a statement that non-routine adjustment amounts can be placed into the drainage adjustment deferral account.
Okay, I now know what you're speaking of. Our interpretation of that is, I think, somewhat different than is what's been mentioned today. Our interpretation of that is if we have a very large non-routine adjustment that would have rate shock, that's the point we propose to use a deferral account in order to moderate the rate increases over time. We didn't interpret that as being something for true-ups.
But that's what a deferral account is. It's something for true-ups.
Well, in the sense of, yes, the sense of the spend. I understand what you're saying.
So your statement that there are no deferral accounts in this or previous PBRs, you need to adjust that to reflect the existence of this deferral account?
Sure. In hindsight, we should have said active, but even that, I mean, as I think about it, we're using a deferral account for the 90-day deferral program, where we're emulating what the AUC has done. And so I guess technically we could say, yes, that's an incorrect statement, that there's deferral accounts that are not active and there's one that we are using today.
Yep. So I went through the bylaw and I summarized the purpose of the non-routine adjustment as follows. It's there for unusual, significant in size or nature, for events that are unusual, significant in size or nature, and beyond the scope of control of management. Would you agree with that statement?
Yes.
Would you agree with my definition of a deferral account, which is that it is there to protect shareholders from loss of return arising from such events, and protect customers from consequences arising from utility reluctance to negatively impact earnings?
I think that's a fair definition, yes.
And would you agree with me that those two definitions are essentially the same?
Yes.
So a deferral account is very similar to a non-routine adjustment. I'm asking the question, do you agree that a deferral account is very similar to a non-routine adjustment?
I don't, I'm just thinking that through. You know, I would, just off the top, without giving it a lot of thought, think that, you know, there's certainly maybe some aspects that are the same, but there's probably others that are not.
And what aspects would be different?
Well, the non-routine adjustment, as we believe it's fashioned, is pretty much no different than any other capital that's approved. It's just approved at a different point in time. And a non-routine a deferral account is something for a specific initiative, which, you know, I guess you could argue that a non-routine adjustment is as well, but I'm not seeing them as exactly the same.
Okay. Also on page 9, you talk about the value of the PBR framework would be reduced if a deferral account for consumption variance was implemented. It would diminish the utilities' incentive to manage costs, consumer incentives for water conservation, which we've already talked about, price signal distortion, rate volatility and unpredictability, bill complexity, and utilities earnings volatility. So in exchange for removing those items, is it fair to say that EPCOR is asking for a rate of return higher than the generic rate of return as compensation?
Yes, because there's other risk factors beyond just those, as we've mentioned.
Oh, well, I thought this was a comprehensive list that you put on page 9. The restructuring of the PBR framework will have consequences. And then you list 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 items. Nothing more on that?
Maybe you could repeat your question, because
You indicated that the implementation of a consumption deferral account would have those negative impacts. Is that correct?
it would definitely have a number of negative impacts, both with the customer and I think in the utility, because whenever we're,
Yeah, that's in the list.
yeah,
Utilities earning volatility.
well, also it's an incentive, you know, and I think we've demonstrated that when we do have revenues below budget, there's an additional incentive for us to find even more efficiencies, and we typically have done that in the past. So we manage the business more as we would in a commercial basis as opposed to just a regulatory basis.
I don't know, that sounds to me like an argument for increasing the productivity factor. But I'll move on. In my report, the EPCOR 2022 PBR applications review by the Utilities Advisor, I complained about the quality of the business cases. In your response, you didn't say anything about that. Do you have any comments about what could be done to improve your business cases?
Can I request, are you talking about the net present value analysis? I'm assuming that's what you're referring to?
Net present value analysis and the inclusion of alternatives. And the use of alternatives analysis for capital programs.
Sure. I can comment on that. You know, and I know, Mr. Beckett, you're very familiar with the programs, but for those in the meeting that might not be, the application contains several programs. The programs consist of a large number of small projects that individually wouldn't be big enough to.
I think I'll just, why don't you finish, and then we'll deal with the time question, because we'll have to go back to committee to see if committee's prepared to do more time on this, so we can do that, but so as not to interrupt your thought.
Sorry, can would you like me to finish
Yes,
the question
please.
then?
Yeah.
Okay, sure. So none of the projects would be individually large enough to require a business case in the application. But the projects within a program are all very similar in nature, and so within the application, we've grouped them together and explained them all as one. Examples of the programs include high priority repairs, manhole cover and catch basin replacements, neighborhood renewal programs, those types of things. These programs were all started when drainage was part of the city, and we think drainage did a really good job when they were with the city of managing them in that way, so we haven't changed that within drainage. And you are correct, in the application, there isn't net present value analysis, and in many cases, there aren't alternatives either. And there's a few reasons for that. The first is that in most cases, the lowest cost technical solution for each individual project will be different from the other projects within that program. And so, you know, the only way to do a net present analysis would be to list out every individual program. And in some cases, there might be thousands of small projects within each program. The second reason is that many of the programs are reactive in nature. So they're not planned in advance. And I gave you examples of some of the programs. They include things like the high priority repair program, the manhole and catch basin replacement program. And so we don't know what's going to fail. When something fails, that program is established in order to respond and carry out the capital project required to respond to that failure. We don't know that in advance. We don't know which lines are going to fail, and so we cannot in advance, at the time of the application, do an analysis of the alternatives and a net present value of the different alternatives. What we do know is we know annually how many tend to fail, and we know annually what the cost of those failures are, and so that's what's used to project the financial cost in the application. You know, similarly, there's a program in there for private development. Again, we know historically what those volumes are, and we look at economic indicators, but the work is driven by the development community. It's outside of our control, and so when something comes up, we'll look at the best alternative, but again, we can't do that in advance. And I know we've received these comments before, and our attempt to try and answer it was to put business cases in that explain what the different programs are, the process for determining the lowest cost option for each project within a program, and then how we forecasted both the volume of work and the cost of the work within that program in the application. And we described the internal governance and approval processes that are in place to ensure that we've looked at the options for each project when they come up. I have to tell you, especially for some of the things that are proactive, I physically don't know how I could do a net present value analysis, but I can suggest that if there's further discussions that we can have to see what would satisfy the needs of administration and the utility advisor, we're more than happy to do so.
Thank you. So, Mr. Beckett, this is new territory for us. We had put a 20-minute time limit on this, but our procedure does allow us, if committee so wishes, to extend your time.
I have about 5 minutes more of questions.
Perfect. So it's up to committee. If somebody would like to move another.
I'll move an extension to Mr. Beckett's time.
Do you want to put is the motion until he's completed or a specific time?
Until he is completed, it's
Great.
fine.
Okay, so that is moved, and please vote.
I am a yes. Just a quick question. Can we compel Mr. Beckett to keep going for the next 3 hours?
No. But you can try. That would be a different motion, however.
Mr. Clerk.
I'm a yes as well.
I'm not seeing it come up.
Thank you. There's a bit of a delay.
Okay,
but,
I'm a
if you-
yes.
thank
So
you.
is there any objection to that? Let's do it that way.
Oh, there we go.
There it is. There's the vote. Okay. I think I heard 2 yeses, so you have mine. Do we still need 2 more?
No, we have all the votes
Great.
now.
Please please display the vote. And that has passed. The floor is back to you, Mr. Beckett.
Well, thank you very much for the offer to discuss a business case. I think we'll take you up on that. The reason I'm focusing on this is that it's important to understand the future revenue streams that occur as a result of today's decision. So if you make a like-for-like replacement, I can understand that. But if you find an opportunity to improve something, that generates savings and future O&M costs. And I believe the Utility Committee would be interested in knowing what those are on a going forward basis so that that can be incorporated into future applications. Okay, I'm on page 6 of 7 of my report. The section entitled "The Role of Utility Management versus Role of the Regulator." This particular item came about because of an information request I sent you to find out the historical basis for the decision to reduce EPCOR's greenhouse gas footprint within the city. And you responded that the decision was an environmental leadership decision reached internally. So the question I've got for you is, when you make a decision like that, do you feel any obligation to advise the regulator of that decision, the implications of that decision, and any alternatives that you are assessing to achieve that initiative? Because in this particular application, you didn't do any of those.
Oh, I can start on this one, and maybe Martin can jump in. So the basis of that being included, as you may recall, that probably 4 or 5 years ago, the rates and procedures bylaw was changed, and one of the things that was added to it was that we would align with City of Edmonton environmental goals. And so we did it under that context. You know, perhaps in hindsight, we should have brought it forward and been more fulsome, but I guess I would say it's included, but it's not approved, and so we could consider it for approval at this point in time.
But what are you asking to have improved? Like, I can't find any details on how you're going to do that and what the costs associated with doing it are going to be.
Well, I thought it was fairly well explained in one of the IRs, but perhaps it needs more detail.
Perhaps, yeah. In one of your responses, and it was a response to a question that the City of Edmonton asked, COE EPCOR 17. One of the questions there was to identify full-time equivalents, and you responded that you do not actively track full-time equivalents, so you couldn't provide a breakdown by operational function. How do you budget if you don't keep track of your forecast full-time equivalents?
So maybe I can answer this one. We do budget headcount. We don't, and we apply a vacancy factor to the headcount. But our HRIS system can give us a point in time information on what our headcount is and what the employment status of each person working within EPCOR is. What we can't do is go back and get historical reports for previous points in time. So to do that reconciliation, we'd need to know on a prospective basis and then put the tracking in place, because the HRIS system can give us, and as we're preparing the budget, we can get that information, but we can't go back and do a reconciliation retroactively because the data's not there.
Do you use the same HRIS system as EPCOR distribution and transmission?
We do. They track it manually by spreadsheets, which we have not done.
But you could.
We could. It's cumbersome, as you know, but we could.
So wouldn't it be in EPCOR's interest to modify the HRIS system so that both these utilities and EPCOR distribution and transmission could have that information more easily?
So I think, as you know, modifying an HRIS system is not a small undertaking, so it's something we could certainly have a look at, but at this point, you know, we would not know the answer to whether or not that would make any financial sense to do so.
Okay, you'll be happy to know I've only got 3 more questions, unless one of your answers leads to another question. I asked the question, information request number 7. The in-city revenue requirement included in the application assumes that all identified incentive compensation is awarded to employees. Now, my familiarity with incentive compensation is that this is a very touchy subject. Management is rightfully reluctant to disclose who is going to get incentive compensation, how much incentive compensation they're going to get, and what targets they have to meet to achieve that incentive compensation. I understand all that. I've been on the other side of that argument, so I believe me, I understand it. But it does raise the question, how does the utility regulator ensure that incentive compensation objectives are being set to meet the interests of customers and not solely the interests of the shareholder?
So I can speak at a high level. When we look at total compensation for our employees, base compensation, that is their annual salary, for example, is not set at the market target. We set it slightly below target. And we do that by design, and the incentive compensation in total, if those targets are met, are then better aligned with what we see as market conditions. So we do surveys on an annual basis, and we compare our salaries for equivalent positions with other utilities of like size and shape in this country, and we compare cost, and that's how we set, at a high level, I'm by no means an HR expert, but that's how we set our compensation levels and our targets.
But now perhaps you could answer my question. How does the regulator determine that those targets are set to further the interests of customers and not solely the interests of the shareholder?
If I could make an observation here, in terms of the internal targets for staff, those aren't set by the regulator, they are set by the company. But what is set by the regulator are the performance targets for the entire utility, which include environment and quality and social and safety measures. So it's really that mechanism that's used to ensure utility management is focused on a full and diverse set of outcomes rather than the compensation system.
And I'll just add to that often the underlying metrics that we see in the PBR are in fact carried over to the incentive program. So that's one of the mechanisms to ensure that there's alignment.
Okay, last question. If EPCOR was directed to file a compliance filing for these applications reflecting the following adjustments, how long would it take you to prepare that compliance filing? And the adjustments are those adjustments as you've already agreed to, so that was the valve casings and the debt. Drainage return on equity as contained in the application, a deferral account for variable revenue, $500,000 above or below the forecast for each of water services, wastewater treatment, and drainage services, water and wastewater return on equity equal to the Alberta Utilities Commission generic rate of return, and a drainage X factor of 0.5%. I don't want you to dispute any of those items. I just want to know how long it would take you to prepare that filing.
Just off the top, I would say probably 3 weeks, maybe more. Probably no more than a month.
Thank you. Those are all my questions.
Thank you very much. So that brings us to, I think, next, if I'm following the set out, it's time for us to ask questions of any of the people we just heard from, except the two speakers who we've already asked questions of. So, who wants to go first? Nobody. Well, I'll jump in if nobody else seriously doesn't want to ask questions. I'm happy to start. Oh, there's somebody up. Councillor McKean.
Mr. McKean is fine too, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to start off with a real sort of high level one. We have just been through an extremely, and it continues, extremely difficult time with this pandemic. Difficult for your commercial and your residential customers. Please tell me how this PBR application reflects the coming out of this pandemic and the difficulties that your residential and commercial customers are likely to still face in the next year or two?
That's a good question, Councilor, and I'll take the first swing at it. So we have the same concerns where we see our customers struggle coming out of this global pandemic, and I think it's compounded here in Alberta with some of the challenges with the economy. So that's why when we looked at the amount of capital that we need to place in the 3 business units, and we looked at setting some sort of return that's reasonable, we've made the decision to request a phase-in of the drainage ROE over a 5-year period of time, right? So the current drainage PBR application is for 3 years, and in those 3 years, by phasing in our returns, we're saving our customers $66 million. So we tried to tackle it from the rate side of the equation first, and then we looked at what's driving the rates. And we felt that we had received this direction in the past from Utility Committee and City Council that the SERP and core program for drainage is a priority. So we continued to fund those. Now again, we're funding those at a level much lower than what was originally contemplated, and that was just through our due diligence of running the assets and get a better understanding of those programs. So that in itself has saved customers, I think, some money versus what we were looking at in some previous Grant Thornton reports in terms of long-term forecast. But then we wanted to balance that investment against the rest of the business. And we felt very comfortable on the water side of the equation, for example. We've managed that utility for quite a long time, and we've balanced the amount of capital we're placing there to allow us to continue to fund the necessary infrastructure and drainage. So when you peel back this rate application, we mentioned it in our summary at a very high level, the increase for just base operations, just us doing our job day in and day out, it's less than $1 per month for residential customers. The cost to continue to fund the SERP and core program is an additional $3.50. And then there's a transfer of fire protection costs that was requested by the city administration to put into the rate base, which we have done. But we feel that is a net neutral transfer because there will be an offsetting reduction to their property tax bills. So when we step back and we look at the $4+ per month increase, the majority of it is driven by SERP and core, which is again a priority. And we felt that a $1 per month increase starting out for residential customers was reasonable given the economic situation we're in.
Yeah, I hear you, and I see, almost want Mr. Kennedy to respond about the surveys or the engagement work done with Edmontonians, especially residential customers who, if memory serves, were willing to look at an increase of $6 or more. Excuse me, I don't remember the exact amount, but that surprised me. But I guess my question is, and I know this is very detailed, and the city of Edmonton had to do some pretty significant cuts, but to reduce the impact on taxpayers, and maybe I'm just wondering if there was enough here, like, and I guess I can't even ask about FTEs because that, from Mr. Beckett's questions, we don't seem to have that tracked by you, and whether or not there's been any workforce reductions, for example, not saying layoffs, but workforce reductions to reduce costs during an extremely difficult time in this economy. Anything further you'd add to that?
I would say that the efficiencies that have been achieved over time have come from, we did make the commitment not to have any staff layoffs as part of the drainage transfer. But what we've done is, as positions have become vacant, we have done a very serious assessment as to whether there's a different way to do the work so that we don't need to backfill vacant positions. And that has resulted in, again, we don't track FTEs, we do track headcount. And so it has resulted in headcount reductions within the business unit. I would just add that, and I'm sorry, I hope I'm okay continuing, Councillor Henderson, given that we're over on time.
Yeah, his time is up, yours is not. You can
okay,
answer the
thank
question.
you. We have tried to find every opportunity within this PBR to reduce costs wherever we can, and we've tried to balance the needs of a system with some assets in very, very poor condition and the requirement to continue, customers continue to rely on those utility services. And we've tried to find kind of the sweet spot in reducing the costs and the capital expenditures and prioritizing, recognizing that they also rely on those services and need them to be reliable. And so that's how we've addressed it in the PBR applications.
Thank you.
Councillor Banga.
Sorry, you caught me by surprise there. I thought there was somebody else ahead of me, but they must have taken their name off the list, I suppose. I believe I have asked this question before, but I still am not clear. For the incentive for the company to increase efficiency and then pass it on to the customers, where is the driving force behind that?
So historically, our consumption forecast, in terms of what we project our customers to consume, we've overestimated and they've used less. So we generate less revenue than what was authorized to collect through prior PBRs. So in order for us to continue to drive efficiencies within our business and earn a reasonable return on our investment, we have to look internal and find opportunities to cut costs. We've done that through attrition, again, not layoffs, but we've done that through attrition. We've done that by optimizing internal processes to drive efficiency, change some of the programs that we've done previously. Unidirectional flushing, for example. We found much more efficient ways to do that with less people. That saves money. We've done programs like that in between the rate cycles, and then when we go in for a rebasing adjustment, those operating savings are then passed on to customers in terms of rebasing what our new costs look like.
Okay, and so this non-routine adjustment, I know there was a number of 500K thrown around. If somehow in the middle of the year or middle of the PBR year, it appears like there is going to be a shortfall in revenues or going to be more revenues than expected for some reason, what is the mechanism for the EPCOR to come back and say, we got extra money or we don't have enough money?
That's the risk that we take when we move forward and proceed with the PBR. So we assume the risk. If revenues are less than we projected, that's on us to find a way to overcome that. If revenues are a bit better than we expected and our costs remain in check, that's an opportunity for us to finish on the high end of that. But again, there's balance in that, and there's puts and takes throughout the PBR. But that's basically, if you boil it down, that's the rules. You assume all risk. So
where does the term non-routine adjustment come into play?
So those are, I'm sorry, Councillor. Those are the unusual and significant in size impacts that may come to our business. So for example, when the lead standard changed, when the federal government changed the lead standard, we had to put on additional treatment plant capacity, additional chemical treatment to address the issue of lead service lines, lead solder, lead pipes in homes. And that was an unusual and significant impact. So we sought regulatory treatment through an NRA.
Okay, so in those, I'm going to take up a real example there. That big sinkhole on 109th Street in Argyle. is that part of the routine adjustment or non-routine adjustment, or is it the cost of doing the business?
So most of our emergency programs are not part of non-routine adjustments. Most of the responses to emergencies. So if there is a failure, it is usually not part of a non-routine adjustment. On 109th Street, that one actually was something, we found that sinkhole before it happened, and we found it because we were in the area doing work. The system was behaving a little bit strangely. We were installing access manholes as part of the corrosion and odor reduction strategy just down from there. And so that one is a little bit different, and actually there's a new sinkhole that has developed a couple of blocks from here on Jasper that we found in the last 24 hours. It's one where, again, it was identified in the corrosion and odor reduction strategy, that particular manhole as being one that needed to be addressed, and it has now become a new emergency project. So there are some, but most operational emergencies, the one that I had the picture of, the trestle, that would not have been part of a non-routine adjustment, and so it wouldn't have been covered. And even the ones that have happened, like this manhole here, there was a forecasted amount of work to be done in the non-routine adjustment. The fact that there was an emergency that occurred is almost coincidental, other than the fact that we knew that the asset was in bad shape.
Thank you.
Councillor Hamilton.
Thank you. And I appreciate the thoroughness of the questions that have been asked. I'm going to ask, I'll give you like 30 seconds or a minute heads up if we could get the cumulative rate table. But I'll leave that with the clerks to see if we can get that put up on screen, and I'm going to go to another question. So on page 5, so very early on in the PBR, one of the things that caught my attention was you're talking about this rate period as a period of learning, so that as drainage services gains further access in these areas. And what that flagged for me is that it's a period of learning for all of us, but you know, how are we insulating the ratepayer from the risks that come from taking on a new experience? So I was hoping you could speak to that.
Sure. You know, I think when we came forward with the non-routine adjustment for the corrosion and odor reduction strategy, one of the things that we had noted was that the system was built with many parts of it not having access for people to be able to go in, inspect it, maintain it, and see if there's any repairs that are necessary. So I think what the application is referring to is that was accomplished through the corrosion and odor reduction strategy, through the installation of a number of access manholes so that staff can get in and have a look and see what's there. And our hope is that we find things before they have complete failure. And it is much less expensive to proactively repair something than it is after it's failed, particularly because once it's failed, you tend to have, and 109th Street is a great example of the pipe failed, and then it caused the dirt above it to fall into the pipe, get washed away, and something that, had we known about it you know, far in advance and fixed it in advance, you know, might have been, I'm going to say, 10 to 20% of the cost of repairing it as an emergency after it's developed a large void above it. And so by going in and doing the inspections as part of this, we're learning the condition of the asset and able to prioritize those that are in imminent danger of failing so that we can correct the issue in a less expensive way than it would be after the asset actually fails. So it does cost more because you're learning more and you're learning about things that need to be fixed, but ultimately it will result in lower costs for customers.
Oh, okay. So that helps me a little bit because sort of the broad reference, you could take that in terms of operational learnings or capital learnings, but it sounds like this is very much about capital maintenance and deferred maintenance learning for that EPCOR is still trying to understand the condition of the true condition of the entire drainage system. Is that accurate?
Yes, it is. And in particular, there are components that because it was built without access points and it's too deep with too much distance between the access points to be able to use remote technology, which you can sometimes use, but in this case doesn't work, to do an inspection. Some of those parts of the system have actually never been inspected since they were built.
And that's gives some consternation. I guess I'm not going to get to the cumulative rate table question, so I'll just wrap up with this series of questions and have to come back on. We're going to be, the next council is going to be revisiting the PBR in 3 years. And I think one of the sort of concerns I have for the ratepayer is that at that time, well, I think EPCOR is talking about a fairly modest rate of return. We could, in fact, see quite a significant need for investment and the ratepayer having to cover that off. How are you going to communicate the state of the system over the PBR period to the next utility committee?
Well, I would have to say, I mean, I think we're more than happy to make presentations periodically at utility committee to, provide utility committee with updates on what we're finding as we gain access and do additional inspections within the city. We have been working on accumulating inspection data and putting it into a condition assessment report, and those are certainly, pieces of information that we'd be more than happy to share with utility committee.
All right, thank you, and I'll come back for a second round.
Yeah, I'm just going to do a double check with you before I go to Councillor Walters, because I don't think it was in the I don't think the cumulative rate table across all 3 utilities, which I suspect is what you're looking for, was in the presentation today, of anybody's presentation today. I suspect it is in the somewhere in the applications, although it may not be in assembled form. It may be broken out at least between the 3 utilities, and even between the 3 utilities, I suspect it's broken out between different use classes. So I would ask, I suppose, EPCOR if they're aware of that and just being there, because we can go looking for it and see if we can get it up for your next round, Councillor Hamilton. But can you just I'll give you a little bit of leeway here to make sure we're looking for the right thing.
Was that to me or to
Yeah,
EPCOR?
that's to you, just because
Yes,
it's going to take a while to dig it up, so we should just make sure we're looking for the right thing.
Yes, yeah, that's accurate.
So you would like something that can give us a picture of the effective rate changes over all 3 utilities over the 3 years or 5 years?
Yes, and if I guess maybe, and I don't want to take this as a question, so we could take it as a point of order. If that's not available, then maybe that's something that we can have made available.
Fair enough. I just wanted to make sure that they were, because they are, I think we'll spend some time trying to find it, but I just wanted to make sure they were looking for the right thing. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Councillor Henderson, and I don't know if this is going to be helpful, EPCOR does have cumulative rate increases average for residential and commercial, I believe, in their executive summary, that reader's guide.
Okay, so if the clerk can, I think we can probably get that up and displayed if we just needed to know where to look. Great, thank you very much. Councillor Walters, thanks for being patient.
Hey, that's my brand, Ben. No problem. So I think that isn't a good request by Councillor Hamilton. I think our job here is to start with the effects of all of this on the customer's bill. So I'd like to see, kind of from the bill out, would be the shaping of our questions in large part. Just quickly here, so I'll wait for that to be put up. In terms of the drainage application, the capital investment in implementing SERP, what pace does that put us on for the long-term completion of SERP? I know and this may be something you need to remind me of, as you may have described it to us at previous utility committee meetings. What is when we talk about 50 to 100 years, kind of implementing the whole sort of capital plan associated with all of SERP, how far are we getting in this 3-year application, and how does that set the pace?
So, Councillor Walters, when the Stormwater Integrated Resource Plan was originally presented, I think Utility Committee, had given us direction to complete the program over 20 years, and that is still the plan.
Okay.
So we have not extended the timeline of the Stormwater Integrated Resource Plan completion as part of this PBR application.
Okay. Nor sped it up, although 20 years is a pretty good pace. Do you feel like we're being very responsible with that pace? I know the ramifications of us being slow at that pace is we're leaving certain areas of the city, more vulnerable as the climate worsens and extreme weather becomes more of a risk. So this is, just confirming that you feel this is as fast as we can go, and not while managing the rate impacts.
Yeah, I think it's a reasonable pace to go at. We've obviously had to adjust, and we've ended up, because of COVID, some of the earlier activities that we were going to undertake have been pushed back later, and some of the later activities have actually been brought forward so that we can still meet that 20-year timeline. And I think, if we tried to do it much faster than this, you might start to get into some of the logistical problems when you can have when, as an example, too many sports fields are out of service at one point in time, or too much construction is going on at any one point in time on the road. We think it's a reasonable balance between, being able to get it done, and because we're addressing the riskiest areas first, we'll see a higher immediate benefit in the early years of the plan. We think it's a reasonable pace that sort of hits that good balance.
Okay, and we'll talk more about that when we see the rate increases across the average. So one thing I'm a little fuzzy on is the concerns raised about capital funding for city-initiated work. Maybe go through that again with me. What the rub there is, like what's the tension, and what do we need to resolve?
I think from EPCOR's perspective, we took a risk-based approach to programs like neighborhood renewals, and we took the lessons that we've learned through this current PBR and applied some of that logic on a go-forward basis, and we've significantly reduced the level of funding that we have for those programs. We're comfortable with that level of risk. I don't want to speak for administration, and I'll defer to them. What we understand is that there's some concern that there's not enough funding in those programs, and if there's a desire by utility committee to look to revisit that, we could look to do that and make some adjustments and add some additional incremental capital to help close that gap.
Maybe Mr. McNabb, we can ask questions of the whole delegation, right, Ben? So, Mr. McNabb, if you have a bit of clarity you could provide on that, and I know there were some recommendations you made. I'm struggling to keep track of all the all the paper here, but someone from Walters,
yeah, sir. Yeah, you bet. Actually, I was going to ask Mr. Wabham to first answer this one.
Yeah, so when we look at the history of the neighborhood program, we did have set budgets where we coordinated with EPCOR on drainage and on water. And what we saw in the submission on the risk-based approach is that they were proposing to reduce specifically the water budget, but a little bit concerned about the amount of ability based on their overall program to keep pace with the drainage program. A few of those are unknowns. So we just flagged basically that the big thing that we're looking at is our alley program is growing on top of the existing neighborhood program while they're reducing. So it just gets a bit riskier in terms of that alignment of their infrastructure replacement before we put ours down. So what we were suggesting is consideration that we make sure we align well with that and don't run into issues with budget as, council's
So
direction.
I'm out of time, but you're suggesting right now is we're not completely aligned yet. So that's something we need to address through this process.
Or I know you're out of time and I'll just answer that one quickly. It was an awareness for council of on their risk-based analysis, where they're heading versus where council has asked us to go on the neighborhood programs. And we'll work with them on looking at minimizing that risk for this PBR cycle, but it was a flag and an awareness for council of those trends.
My 6 minutes are up. Thank you.
I suspect we will have many more rounds. I know I certainly will. But speaking of which, I'm going to jump in right now. So I'm going to go down into the weeds a little bit on some stuff and sort of scattergun a bit. I actually had a question for Grant Thornton, because I'm interested in, I'm not sure I entirely follow, or I want to do a check-in on this, the A- rating, which seems to me is based not on the utilities rating, but on the parent company's rating. What I'm trying to understand there is, because it seems to me I can understand why there would be more risk for the parent company, and why that might speak to that A- rating. But the utilities themselves seem to me remarkably stable, and I wouldn't mind hearing some thinking about how we know that using an A- rating is for the utility. We're not here adjudicating the parent company. How that plays out and your confidence in that.
I can just speak to that. The A low rating is actually for the regulated operations of EPCOR Water Services, Inc. Specifically. So they do an indicative rating just for the regulated business of EPCOR Water. That includes drainage, wastewater treatment, and the water operations within Edmonton.
But this is where I'm getting, but you're actually not borrowing on the open market, you're borrowing through EPCOR. So the rate you get is going to be based on EPCOR's rating, not yours.
The rate we get in the market is based on EPCOR's rating, and then EPCOR parent company lends to the various business units based on their individual credit ratings. So they're all based on a standalone basis, based on their individual risk profiles of those various business units.
So what I'm not entirely following here is whether or not what we're taking, the 3.5, is based on the rates that EPCOR is going to get or the rates that you could get. Because I think, understanding you borrow through EPCOR, that makes perfect sense to me. But I think from a regulatory point of view, what we need to be basing on is the rates that you could get in the open market. And I'm happy if EPCOR can get a better rate. I want to do a double check on the fact that that's true.
That's true. EPCOR Water Services could theoretically, if they were lending in the market, they could get credit at an A-low basis based on that indicative rating. And that's why it's done in that manner.
And that's the 3.5?
Yeah.
Okay. The other thing which is sort of linked to that, Mr. Manning, you sort of made reference, and I think I take Grant Thornton's point on this one around the length of the asset, because you made a reference to the fact that that's why, for instance, bonds are more expensive. A 30-year bond is more expensive than a 20-year bond, but it seems to me the 30-year bond is more expensive because you're gambling against rates that are 30 years out instead of 20 years out. That's the unknown. In the case of your assets, you know how much you paid for them. That's not going to change. The ratepayer is giving you money to maintain those assets. That's not a question. And the moment that you do need to go in, you get to capitalize them and you begin to start getting returns on them. So I'm struggling a little bit with that point, and I just wanted to give you a chance to respond to that.
Well, I will ask Robert Evans, who is our external expert in these matters, to provide his perspective. I think that would be more informative.
Mr. Chairman, irrespective of whether there is any risk associated with bonds or not, so let's assume that we're talking about Government of Canada bonds, you are quite right that the longer term bonds have have a higher yield than the shorter term bonds. And that is the kind of capital recovery risk that Mr. Manning is talking about. You know, when you buy the bond, what you pay for it at that moment of time, just as you do with an asset that you're going to put into service here. You also know with the bond how much you're going to get back when that bond matures. And so there's absolute certainty around that. But the issue is that investors simply, if they've got to put up their money for 57 years versus 30 years versus 10 years, they're more nervous about going farther out into the future. And you face more uncertainty respecting default on the bond, respecting how much inflation there is, which affects the real value of what you get back at the end. The risk is simply higher the further out you go, and that doesn't even go to the question of whether, for example, the assets deteriorate more over a longer period of time. You can see that phenomenon happen even with long-term Canada bonds versus short-term bonds, where there's no default risk at all.
I'm out of time, but I know, my point was they're apples and oranges. An asset is an asset, a bond is a bond, and 30 years they play by different set of rules. Anyway, I'm out of time, so maybe I'll come back to that again. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, I'm not seeing any. Do we have anybody up for a second round yet? I think we do have the table in front of us now, if that's helpful to either the people that wanted to ask questions about the table. Councillor Hamilton, Councillor Walters? There we go, Councillor Hamilton.
I'll pop on. And I pulled that up in front of me as well. So if you could, there's two tables. You can throw them. I think it's probably asking too much to throw them both up on the screen at the same time. But I wanted to ask about the value of the rate increases across the 4-year period cumulatively. And if you could verbalize for me what those rates increase by. Maybe I'll give you a minute.
So, Councillor Hamilton, I just want to make sure I can answer your question.
Yep.
So, on this spreadsheet, we show that in 2021, the average residential bill is $100.86, that first column. Then it increases by 6.6% in the first year of the next PBR to $108.60. And above that, we talk about the various components that are increasing or decreasing. So we walk you through kind of a waterfall down to $108.60. And then it increases by another $2.5%, excuse me, to $111.29, and then in 2024 it increases to $116.29, which is an additional 4.5%. So on average, it's an increase of 4.5% per year over those 3 years. You're asking for the cumulative percentage. Okay, we'd have to just run those numbers. It looks like it's. Hold on one second. So, Councillor Hamilton, by my math, it's a 14% cumulative increase over 3 years. That's the difference between the 101.86 the 116.29. And that,
Thank you for that. Sorry, you were going to say? I interrupted you.
I'm
Sorry,
sorry.
did you have something additional to add?
No, thank you.
There's and this is the residential bill, looking at the commercial change, that change is more substantive in raw, like in actual numbers. Is that, do you have a similar comparator in terms of percentage wise? We do see that 13% increase in the first year, which made me start a bit.
Councillor Hamilton, can I also just point out that that increase includes it's not an overall number to the customer, because it also includes the increase for fire protection charges, where customers will see an offsetting decrease on their tax bill as a result. So I think we don't have the number without that, those fire protection costs included. We don't have the cumulative number, but that is something else to keep in mind.
And I guess that was kind of leading into my next question, which is about what other regulatory strategies you looked at to reduce the costs and rate increases. And the fire is an interesting one because it's coming off the tax bill and going on to the utility bill. But that may not be readily apparent to ratepayers off the bat.
Yeah, we do agree that that may not be readily apparent to ratepayers. In terms of, to strategies to reduce it, it really just comes down to some of the things that we've spoken about in our presentation, and trying to find efficiencies, trying to rationalize the capital spend, to direct the money towards the highest risk areas, to offer up the voluntary reduction, recognizing that economic recovery is ongoing, and those are the things that we've tried to do to just reduce the impact to the customers throughout the PBR period.
All right, thank you. I've somehow run out of time again, so
I think we will have many more rounds. I know I will, so that's fine. That's what we're here to do. This is a lot of, what I would say is we have a lot of information here, and it's going to take some time, and that's okay. I think this is going to lock things down for 5 years. We need to get it right. Councillor Walters.
Thanks. So just to pick up there on the question Councillor Hamilton started asking about value, and I think this, rate setting exercises are complicated, and ultimately part of our job is to make sure, as Councillor Henderson said, we get this right, but part of it is also to demonstrate the value associated with everything that's contained within here, which ultimately leads to numbers that show up on people's bills that they have to pay. So the value associated with these increases, just from a communications perspective, in a way, can be largely associated to the stormwater, like the flood mitigation and the SERP, which we've talked a lot about as a committee, and can be associated with the corrosion and odor reduction strategy, in addition to just the general, asset management and renewal and capital expansion. So maybe just talk a little bit about what those increases buy for our ratepayers. Like I think the big ones, like the things that when we're saying, look at it, it's a 13% increase over those 3 years cumulatively, that's not insignificant. So there needs to be something significant that we say to people. So, and I know it's all in here, but there's a lot there, and I think it's important for you to say that out loud. Questions to EPCOR?
So, Councillor Walters, I think that the first thing that I would say is that in You're correct that a large dollar value goes towards the Stormwater Integrated Resource Plan and the corrosion and odor reduction strategy. Obviously there's the transfer of fire protection, and I do agree with the comment that that should be cost neutral to customers, but it may not be readily apparent to them. I think my assessment would be that, the drainage system has taken a large proportion of the capital investment in this PBR period. And I think how I would characterize it is that the drainage infrastructure has probably gotten to a state where much of it is in fairly poor condition, and we're seeing an increasing number of failures. As we've seen in a couple in your ward and all along the same line in Allendale, and then again on 109th and 61st, and as we've seen in the last 24 hours on Jasper Ave, a block and a half from here. So I think what we're buying is continued reliable service provision, and in a system that has reached, it's probably been a little underfunded, quite frankly, and it's now at a point where some of the assets are in the condition of imminent failure. And I think, it's not necessarily in that sense the nicest message to people, because I think they want to see themselves getting something new and better. But I think, we have reached the stage where, there's a little bit of an infrastructure deficit that's already there, and we're kind of climbing our way out of it.
Okay.
In addition to that, they are getting protection that they will see from home flooding. And I do think that's one area where, for every individual customer, that flooding can be quite a large expense. And, there's various different ways you can try and fund that through, insurance or, but even that is very difficult to get now, flood insurance. And so I think that's one where there is a very positive benefit to customers in seeing reduced exposure.
Just to interrupt you, Amanda, sorry, because I'll run out of time on the round. That question about flood insurance is also an important part of this, and we had done we'd had some conversations about how our CERP program could lead to lower premiums, and certainly the cost avoidance of people having to renovate their basements or deal with damage to their homes or businesses from flooding. What can you say specifically? What do we know about that? Is there a straight line from the investments we make to lower premiums on people's home insurance?
So, Councillor, there's a report that's coming forward to Utility Committee in August, and there is work that's underway. We do not yet have the answer to that question because we're working with the insurance companies to try and get them to recognize that as part of their quotes for insurance, but that's still a bit of a work in progress. So unfortunately, there at this point is not a straight line. For a customer who can't get insurance, obviously the increase in rates pays itself hundreds of times over, if not thousands, with the damage that can occur. But in terms of for the average customer getting insurance, we cannot at this point yet draw a direct correlation.
Thanks. I'm out of time again. Thank you.
Councillor McKean.
Thank you. I thought that was a really astute line of questioning, because we will have to obviously defend these rates as representative of ratepayers and taxpayers. So with that in mind, with the fire service cost being transferred over the $20 million, is Ms. Pearson still on the line?
I am, Councillor.
Do you have any notion yet on what reduction that would represent of demand on the tax base?
So Counselor, there is a difference in the budget. We had 13 million set for next year, so there was an increase in the fire protection that is moving over there. But with that, I'm just doing some quick math. We are projecting to see a 0.75 to 0.8 reduction next year on the tax side.
Right. Okay, so nearly getting close to a percentage point then, so that's good to know. Mr. Kennedy, are you still on the call?
Absolutely, Councillor.
Yeah, good to hear your voice. So when you did this engagement with the public, and I expressed maybe a little bit of skepticism earlier about ratepayers being willing to pay as much as the report suggested, but tell me then, and, you know, just kind of what Councillor Walters was going through, the programs that are in this PBR around things like odor control and overland flooding and the work being done on issues like that. You probably didn't get into fire protection, but like, were you able to spend enough time with people that you could walk them through all these issues and they might have more of an aha moment?
Yeah, one of the strongest themes actually in the research and in the discussions, whether it was large group or in the surveys, protecting communities from flooding came across as a very strong theme that people were interested in seeing investment, as was the reliability of infrastructure. You know, there have been great strides made in reducing water main breaks, but I think people are more aware over the last couple of years of interruptions and events in drainage infrastructure. They've got a strong environmental message to us about reducing contaminants back to the river. It's an area we perform very well in, but it's a high value, high priority item. And when you combine that with the perception with the public, and it's the same with us, that there is no room for compromise on water safety, water quality, I think it creates a context that makes this a bit of a different topic for many stakeholders. So I'm as surprised as anyone when I find any receptivity to an increase in a bill. I can't say I expected to find that coming into this, and particularly given when we had these conversations, which were really heavily weighted to the back half of last year, and certainly if you recall, the public mood toward the end of 2020 was not in a very good place, and yet we found even in the final end of those conversations a lot of receptivity to targeted investments, especially around flood prevention and around the integrity of the infrastructure.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I think infrastructure deficit can be A, maybe a little hard to comprehend, and B, while we could put some of that work off to tomorrow, might be sort of the human nature way to look at it. So that's really intriguing. So tell me, that level of, you're not going to continue with that level of engagement, but does EPCOR have communication plans coming out of this, which would continue to explain what the rates are paying for, including things like reducing water main breaks, like reducing overland flooding, like working on odor and all those things? Because I think it's important that people understand, you know, people don't necessarily mind paying if they understand what they're getting for it.
Absolutely, and in particular around the implementation of the corrosion and odor program, the implementation of flood prevention. There's very strong sets of communication around those work, which I think also help translate into understanding benefits. But I would also, you know, Sean Bradford in his presentation as well, the simplest way in year one for a residential customer to understand what's happening is you're getting still a high-performing utility that's committed to keep its operating costs increased to less than $1 a month, which is quite something given the size of operation. And for $3 a month, you really are getting flood prevention and corrosion and odor reduction. And then the reason that's possible is that the utilities have voluntarily agreed to reduce the rates, reduce their revenues by $66 million out of sensitivity to the need for social and economic recovery and to be there for our customers.
You should actually do public relations for EPCOR, I think, but thank you very much.
As long as I never run for office.
Yeah. Thanks.
Councillor Banga.
Thank you. Couple more questions that did came to my mind. I was, as I did go through the presentation by EPCOR, on page 29, there is a comparison between water cycle utilities and other utilities. So I don't have any question about, why is the water service utilities, they tend to last longer? Is that what the case is? First, that's clear. Than the other utilities? I thought it would be other way around.
Yes, Councilor, that's correct. Our infrastructure on average lasts longer than natural gas and electric utilities.
All right. And then next is this revenue risk. So anyway, whatever, fixed charges account for 31% of the revenues in water cycle utilities. So, and 69% of the revenue is at risk. But if that risk, for some reason, God forbid, never materializes, what happens to that money?
So if your question, Councilor, is if the consumption by the customer doesn't meet what our expectations are, what happens to our revenue?
Yeah.
We would undercollect our revenue. And when you have wet weather in the summertime, for a prime example, you'll undercollect your revenue. So the last 2 summers were fairly wet. I think the second and third wettest in the last 10 years. And our revenues that we collected, that we planned on collecting, were significantly lower in those summer months. But our cost to run the utility do not change in an equivalent fashion. The majority of our costs are fixed, and the majority of the revenue we collect is variable. That's the challenge that we have that's significantly different than utilities that are regulated by the AUC.
Okay. So for a dry summer, relatively dry summer like this one is so far, the costs are going to remain the same. However, the income or whatever revenues are going to be bigger due to higher consumption. I'm talking about water, and it's probably true for other utilities too that are under your portfolio. So my question to you is, if that is, are you in? I mean to ask you is, so are we over collecting now?
Over collecting for this year, or
Well, at least for this year. Let's just. Okay.
Today will be today will be a good day for water sales. It's quite hot. This weekend will be a good weekend for water sales. It's quite warm. At the beginning of the year, we had a fairly wet few months, and revenues were down.
Mm-hmm. And people are working from home too. But that's different.
And that's a risk that we have to assume.
Okay. But again, we assume the risk. It is the customers that pay for it. So if, let's say, there is a saving realized, let's say if the city gets a surplus and then we go back and reduce taxes for the year after, or whatever the case may be, what does EPCOR do? If, let's say, there are favorable conditions for revenues,
I'm not following your question. I apologize. So what do we do if we have favorable revenues?
Yeah,
Our earnings increase.
earnings increase, but even, do they actually get passed somehow back to the customers?
No, as an organization, we would retain those earnings. And then again, as part of the construct that we have as the city being a shareholder, we pay a dividend on an annual basis.
I am well aware of that, but again, I was just concerned about, if the savings get passed on to the customers, the consumers.
So I think, Councillor, maybe a way to think of it is, based on historical consumption and consumption trends, we forecast our best estimate of what the forecast is going to be, and the general, I think, philosophy is that, if you've done a decent job of your forecasting, you may have some years where consumption is a little over, as Sean mentioned. If it's very hot and dry, you may be a bit over one year, and then the next year you're a bit under. And so, what the aim is to smooth that out for customers, so that on a year-to-year basis, you're sort of charging them the average, and then in any given year, you might be over or under. And if we're under, we don't ask customers to pay that back. If we're over, we don't give the money back to customers. And you sort of hope that it averages out over a period of time, that customers are paying for the volume that you've projected. I don't know if that's helpful or not.
And just
It is.
to add,
Yep.
more revenue does not necessarily mean more profit for the company. The conditions in the river, in terms of cost of treatment, can have a significant impact on the amount of money it costs to treat all of that water. So while we may sell a lot of water this weekend, if we start to see turbidity and color increase, our treatment costs are going to increase significantly this weekend. So again, it's not a direct correlation that when it's warm out, we make more money. When it's wet out, we don't. It also depends on operating factors, and the biggest one there that's easiest to explain is the condition of the raw water in the river.
Thank you, my 7.5 minutes are up.
Is up, yeah. And we are at that magical time when we need to take a break. So we're about 2 minutes over, so let's come back in, about 3:47. What I will say, I'm seeing Mr. Sebrick in the house. I would be very surprised if we get to the waste stuff today. I will be delighted if we can finish this item. I'm not convinced we will. So just as a heads up for your folk, if that's useful.
Councillor Henderson,
Yep.
should we just phone that to the overflow, because there are speakers that are waiting?
Sure. If we'd like to do that motion now, yeah, I can't imagine getting this done today, so.
Well, let's just give everybody the clarity and
All right, so I think our overflow is the 7th. Do I have that right, July 7th?
Yeah.
July, just 1 second here. I believe it's July 9th.
Oh,
MJ,
sorry.
can you confirm that?
July 9th?
9th, yes.
So, and is it another full day or just a half day? Full day.
It's a
Okay,
full
so
day.
we can't tell you, if we don't complete this today, we'll have to complete this then to those speakers, but I don't think we'll get to the waste, so we can certainly push it off and say that item will happen on July 9th.
Okay, I'll move that.
Okay.
Those two items.
So move to July 9th. Any discussion? Actually, it's more than 2 items, it's 3 items. Yeah, 3 items
Yeah, right.
altogether.
The private
Yeah.
item.
All in favor? Or, sorry, please vote. Or is anybody opposed to that? Let's just do it that way so we can get on with our break. Is there anybody opposed? Is that all right, Mr. Clerk, if we do it that way rather than voting?
Yes, I would just like to mention that you should set the meeting first. We haven't actually passed a motion to set a
Okay,
meeting.
then let's come back and do this after the break, and we'll do it properly. Thanks, though, point well taken, and we will do that after the break. So if anybody who's on for that item, rest assured that we will go through the hoops to make that happen. this drives something bigger. I was intrigued by the references on the operation side in all three PBRs, I think, to carbon tax. And I was puzzled why carbon tax is a factor when there's a commitment to buy 100% renewable electricity. And the reality was the amount of natural gas, particularly at Gobar where we make our own, was pretty minimal. So I was really puzzled by that carbon tax reference because it seems to me the good news of a business case that has green power to it should be the carbon tax impact should be next to nothing. So I don't know who wants to respond to that.
Well, I can just respond generally. I believe in the application, it's largely on the natural gas consumption and also on fuel.
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah.
It actually does. The application suggests that it's on power as well.
Yeah.
But which is really, I was puzzled why it would be on power if we're going. I'm not really concerned about that question, but it does lead to another question, which was, I'm completely supportive of the green piece, of green power piece, but I was surprised to find out we were doing it through RECs. Because my understanding was that it actually was a power purchase agreement that was being talked about, and I know that wearing my shareholder hat rather than through here. And I think those are legitimate questions that probably we need to understand here, because there are a number of different ways of achieving that end, and it would, how a carbon tax would fit into that, how we could save money on a carbon tax. All those kind of things should be factors in the business case on how, not whether we do it, but how we do it. And I wouldn't mind hearing some commentary on that, because I wouldn't be, somebody would have to make a case to me why RECs are the right way to go. Any thoughts?
So Councillor Chairman, I think we're going to hand this off to Craig Bonneville. He can speak to what we're doing on the rec side of things.
Very good. Good afternoon, Councillor. Oops. Let's get rid of that too. Yeah, so we looked at a variety of options to green our electricity consumption. As you know, a portion of that has been accomplished with the E.L. Smith Solar Farm project, but the remainder electricity consumption was from the grid, and we obviously just get the grid mix when we do that. And although the grid is slowly greening over time, to meet commitments of going to 70% by 2025, we had to go off the grid. And RECs are generally, especially RECs from Southern Alberta wind generated power, are really the most economical way to accomplish that goal of 70% by 2025.
But there was a reference in here, though, in one of the PBRs, Lord knows I can't remember which one, that was many days ago, to actually, I thought, doing a power purchase agreement with a new wind power. So that's why which is not a REC. That's a different thing, right?
Yeah.
So and that to me, I think I would want to see the business case on that. But I think that to me, is, makes more sense than the REC in a lot of ways, especially with the buying power you have.
You can do both ways. So you can enter an agreement with a generator, say of wind power, to only take the RECs, or you can take the RECs and the power, or you could just take the power for that matter. In this case, through looking at those options and I don't have all the analysis in front of me, of course, but it was deemed best to only take the RECs from this development, and our actual powers through separate agreements sought through competitive energy-only contracts.
Which means, getting back to my original point, which is why I think a business case would have been useful, which means you're still paying carbon tax. And that begins to play in again, does it not?
I'm trying to think through that question, Councillor. You're paying a premium on top of the energy purchase for the REC, certainly, but I think that the carbon levy is a separate line item, so that I don't think that's the case, but we'd have to get back to you to explain that separately.
And I don't need it sorted out now. It's really just to follow up, I think, on why, why having a little bit more business case on this, I think, was something that was a value. And I recognize it's sort of water under the bridge at this point. Maybe it isn't. But I think all of this, the answers to these questions, I think, to Mr. Beckett's point, would have been borne out by us understanding a little bit more about this deal, given that the ratepayers are paying for it. Which, I'd support doing it. Anyway, I'm out of time, and I will go back to Councillor Walters.
Thanks, Ben. So just to come back to the city-initiated work, you brought us this sort of gap between, what EPCOR's put in for capital and what you think we may need there for some of that pre-neighborhood renewal work. You brought that to us for awareness, but presumably you have some worry about that. So I guess, related to my last questions about, justifying, which I think we do very well justify this level of rate increase across all the services, particularly in drainage. It's still a chunky enough rate increase that we got to be pretty careful to try to prevent against surprises or non-routine adjustments down the road. So maybe a little bit more on what you want us to do about the city-initiated work gap.
So what we actually submitted for a question to EPCOR was, can we consider going back to the levels of alignment of the neighborhood program with the existing amount of dollars that they had in the old one? And I think it's probably good if EPCOR gives a response to that, because they did give a written response in there too. Okay. And so I think we should give them an opportunity. But yeah, we do see risk growing, if not this PBR, for sure in the future. And right now our teams are working proactively on aligning our programs. And just making sure that we minimize that risk. So it's a bit tricky one to have 100% direction, but it was, like I said, transparency of what we're seeing coming. So that works for you.
And EPCOR can respond. I'll dig out the answer here from one of the many attachments.
I would ask Mark Mathon to just speak on our coordination with Neighborhood Renewal Program. I think he's in the best position to get you the answer you need, Councillor Walters.
Hi, Councillor. Can you hear me okay?
I can, yeah, thanks.
Okay, great, thank you. So we went at this multi-level approach. First of all, we wanted to make sure that, and you've heard it throughout the PBR presentation, that we wanted to really go a risk-based approach. So we're spending the right dollars on the infrastructure that needs it the most. And what we found is not just to go at it just on a breaks criteria, that bunch of different things, breaks, whether it's got environmental impacts, like if it's close to a water course, if it's close to critical or high-level infrastructure such as City Hall, and as well as neighborhood renewal. So all of that criteria is lumped into a risk-based renewal program that we think we can address the neighborhoods that are going to be addressed with renewal improvements. And we think we can fold that into within that program as well. A bunch of other initiatives. We're looking at programs for artificial intelligence that will help us to predict possible breaks. It is something that's happening in the water industry right now that we're investigating. We're also working a lot with the neighborhood renewal work to make sure that we evaluate the neighborhoods that they're going to go into and see what the break percentages have been historically. We've done a lot of renewal work around the city of Edmonton in the past 20 years, And we've actually got really good data on where hotspots are and where they're not. So
Okay.
it's,
Well,
I'm not sure if that answers it,
yeah,
sir.
that's fine. Let's leave it there for now. And I got one more question I want to sneak into this round. So thanks for that, Mark.
Okay,
I
thank
think
you.
you talked about the economic recovery rebate as well. That may, I can't remember if it was you or someone who talked about that needing to be recalculated. And I guess I want a little bit more on the, when, how it's going to get recalculated, what kind of effect that would have. Would that to a non, like what effect is that? Is there going to be a change required? I don't know that would be categorically a non-routine adjustment, but maybe a little more on that too.
Yeah, good question. So what we've asked to allow to happen is, and it's not part of the PBR framework, but we've asked to phase our returns in over 5 years. Typically, you will take your base business, you'll do a rebasing adjustment, move those assets up to the return that's been authorized by the utility committee, and set your rates, and off you go. We've asked to phase that in over 5 years. The concern that we have is there's been some question regarding the generic cost of capital that's set by the AUC, and using that as the bellwether that would set our returns. And what we're saying is, by already asking for this phase-in, we're essentially earning 8.5% over the next 3 years. If the decision was to impute an ROE of 8.5 on our core business as part of this proceeding, that would push our overall return with the phase-in for drainage probably closer to 7%, which makes it very challenging for us to attract low-cost capital on a go-forward basis. So the point of that statement was, if this is the direction utility committee wants to move in, we may need to reconsider, is it even feasible for us to phase in our returns, or do we have to look at doing something more traditional in rebasing the drainage assets as we exit this process and not phase it in over the multiple years?
Okay, that's based on that scenario, but okay, I understand that. And holy smokes, another 6 minutes just like that.
Time flies when we're having fun. Anybody else? Silence. I will jump back in again then. I'm curious about something. I don't know why I've never asked this question before, and it really only applies to the water piece. But we've always talked about in-city water because we don't regulate the water that goes to the region. But AUC does regulate the water that goes to the region. And a lot of the questions must come up with them as well around this question of the difference in risk and what rate base they set. And I'd be really curious to know what that is.
They set it at the generic with a 70-30 debt equity. But the fundamental difference between the RWCG and this is it's 100% trued up. So what that means is we set an interim rate at the beginning of the year, let's call it $1. And at the end of the year, we run the cost of service models. And if it's 90 cents was our cost, we refund 10 cents. If it was $1.10, we then charge each of the members for the 10 cents. So it's, as I said, a 100%.
There's no PBR risk over time.
No, there is not.
Okay, that's very helpful. It seemed to me like there might be some simple answers there, but I wanted to ask.
Yeah, and it's only regulated on a complaint basis, and we haven't been before the AUC for RWCG since 2012, I think.
No, and it wasn't so much that. I just, this naughty question of what, of having, greater expertise than ours to deal with this question of risk. I thought there might be some answers.
It's a very different system.
Fair enough. I'm interested, though. I'm going to go to this other naughty problem of the NRAs, because I'm struggling with, and I think we're hearing different arguments in the city and from Mr. Beckett on why, but I think I'm inclined to think that there's some valid points there, because I understand your argument that if you can do something more efficiently, if you can achieve a certain end without actually needing to do something, that's part of your efficiency, that's part of what we want you to do. But there are others, there are a number of these in here which that's not the case, where the ratepayer has given you money to do something that has not been done, but that still needs to be done. And it seems to me that we need a way to account for that in a different kind of way, or they're going to end up paying for it twice. That the money that we put into the non-routine adjustment, which was to pay for it, and that's where I think that a deferral or referral account would at least capture that And you know, to be fair, you have accepted that principle, as I understand it, on the solar. And I don't know why it would not apply to the other ones as well. It seems to me, if you had completed it and brought it in under price, that's part of the risk, although I think Mr. Beckett's argument is even at that point it should come under it shouldn't be outside the efficiency factor calculations. But these are things that we've paid for, or that the ratepayer has paid for, that haven't happened, that they're now going to end up paying for again. And that, I think, is a slightly different situation, and I think we need a different way of accounting for that. So your thoughts on that?
So a couple of things, and just being mindful of the clock, this might run long. The rules that exist today when we applied for the non-routine adjustment didn't contemplate this. So I guess the first argument we would make as one of fairness, if we want to change the rules on a go-forward basis, we're all ears for that. And we think that's the fairest way to go forward, so that the next time we seek an NRA, we know that there's a true-up associated with that. But we would again argue that that true-up needs to work both ways, that if we plan on spending $10 million on a project, and for whatever reason that's valid, we spend $12 million, are we going to be afforded the opportunity to recover the additional $2 million?
I understand that. I'm not questioning the true-up question. This is about work that has been paid for that hasn't happened, which is a bit different from truing up against its actual cost. Right? I totally understand the true-up argument. I think that's part of the way this works. Whether or not the efficiency factor should come into that, I think, is another question. But if the only reason we did it on the solar piece is because I asked a question about it, and therefore it was part of the thinking. I mean, that means we would have to ask this question about every NRA, and I think I don't understand why that should be the case. In terms of the fairness principle, what we're trying to do here, and I understand why these projects have been delayed. I'm not questioning that. I understand that may have in itself been out of your control, but we shouldn't be charging people twice for them. And that's ultimately, I think, what we're going to end up doing here if we can't recognize that we've already collected money for doing these things and we're now going to collect it again.
And I think in some of the projects, I can speak specifically to a water example, because we chatted about this over lunch. The the lead mitigation program, we're going to spend $4 million more than the NRA that we requested. We're not putting that in the budget. We're going to spend $2 million this year as part of the last year of this existing PBR in terms of just regular base capital. And then the $2 million that will be needed to finish the project next year, we're not going to charge customers. It's not included in our capital plan. We're just going to spend the money. So we're going to essentially grind our earnings a bit. In a future rebasing adjustment, we could put that as plan in service and earn returns on it, but that's 5 years down the road. But we chatted a bit at lunch. We don't think that there's several instances where we've charged customers for a project today, didn't finish that project, and we're going to recharge them in the future. And I also think it's important to note that the filing was a point in time. We're continuing to spend money on those programs, and we'll be finalizing our actual cost in April of 2022.
And I appreciate that. If it's going to happen, that's fine. If it's going to happen with the last PBR's money, that's fine. We should be able to account for it, and I don't understand why we can't work that in then. I'm out of time, but that's what I'm struggling with. If you're going to be doing exactly what I'm saying you should be doing, why can we not account it that way? Because sitting here in terms of fairness, I think that's, in terms of us making sure that we're not paying twice, which I think we need to recognize it. That's all, and I think we need a mechanism for doing that. So I'm seriously out of time here. Councillor Walters.
Thank you. And I was going to ask about all that stuff too, and I think I agree with where Councillor Henderson's heading there. So I'll just leave it for him to come back. So, Amanda, I wanted to ask about just go back through the risks associated with the drainage assets and the challenges to understand, essentially what you're in for. If there's no better way to put it. Maybe muse with me or with us how those risks, how you see those risks being mitigated over time? Like, is it going to be, like, I suppose on one hand, we could just believe that, you know, until you get down there, you don't really know what's happening. And I know that's burdensome and costly, and you don't always see everything you need to see. But with technology, I wonder if it's going to get easier for us to get a good picture of what's happening. So maybe just, and I'm just not sure if that's going to get better, but maybe it will. So I want you to give you an opportunity to talk about that a bit.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks for the question. I do think it will get better over time, and it'll get better through a number of different avenues. The first is, you're correct, as we continue to gain access to the system, we do continue to explore, are there new and different technologies out there that would work? You know, the challenge we've had up until now is our system in Edmonton is unlike most systems, both in terms of the depth of our trunks and the length of distance between access points. You know, but we do continue to talk to technology providers to see if there's some way to do remote inspections that don't require, you know, human beings to go down there, and that would be better from a bunch of different perspectives, including health and safety, as well as just the ability to, you know, logistically get the data quicker. So, you know, we're continuing to look at technology on that front. We also continue to install the access points and get more data on what the condition of the assets is. In addition to that, as part of the Stormwater Integrated Resource Plan, and these things are all intertwined, but as part of the SERP, we've been installing additional sensors and monitors, and there was some of that included in core, and there's some included in SERP, and you know the between the two of them, we're getting more system information. And the one on 109th and 63rd, that's actually how we knew that the system was behaving a bit funny, because we were able to go to have a look at the flows and see that they seem to have an odd pattern to them, so that we could go in there and actually, I sometimes in the business use the term, we found it before it found us, and that's how we were able to do that. As we continue through these programs and continue to collect data, it will assist us in seeing odd patterns of flow, so that we can go and inspect and hopefully find a problem before it presents itself. We've also been working very hard on our emergency response, and have been looking at better processes to be able to respond when things do occur. So that you know, we can more efficiently complete any repairs that are necessary and just manage that work. So I think, you know, we're on a good path. I think that you know, we know the challenges ahead of us, and I suspect that, you know, this is something that, you know, we're probably looking at 10 years realistically before I would say we'll feel comfortable that we're on top of it. But I think through this next PBR period, we'll see significant progress, and it'll just continue in the years after that.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. I did want to ask, I guess, I think Mr. Manning, when we were talking about, when you were answering Mr. Beckett's questions about the tools or the approaches to enabling conservation, and whether, you know, the rate is the only way to do that. And you said there were other ways to enable or compel conservation other than through rate design. If you were to kind of put that on a pie chart for me, just, you know, visually, not literally, but just, you know, if we were to, like, what percentage or what chunk of our total conservation strategy would come from rate design, and what are the other pieces of that pie? Maybe just illustrate that a little bit more for me. And
well, I would say the vast majority, probably more than 90% of what we do is driven by the rate design and the rate strategy. We do other things, public awareness, just the importance of water conservation. We do rain barrel giveaways, things like that, but they're relatively small in terms of overall impact from what we can tell. You know, we really don't know what is the impact of a ratepayer awareness program. Does that lead to greater or lesser? I really can't say. but certainly everything we've seen is that providing a price signal to ratepayers, particularly a higher price as they consume more, does drive conservation.
Okay, I'm out of time again. We'll need a couple more rounds, I think, Ben. But,
That's fine.
and we forgot to deal with the waste thing, by the way.
Oh, okay. Well, I think at this point, everybody, all right, well, why don't we deal with that quickly, because we'll have to do it for the end of the day. So would somebody like to make a motion to allow Councillor Walters to do a motion without customary notice?
So moved.
Please vote.
We have all the votes, Mr. Chair.
And display the vote. And that's passed. So actually, I realize in Councillor Walters, you probably don't have the motion, but the essence of it would be that we add
That you set a continuation for
that we
this
set a
meeting on
continuation
July
for this 9th.
meeting.
Meeting on July 9th, 9:30.
I see it in front of me now. I can read it in. That the orders of the day for the June 25th, 2021 Utility Committee meeting be changed to continue Friday, July 9th, 2021 from 9:30 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. Number two, that the following items be postponed to the continuation of the June 25th, 2021 Utility Committee meeting on July 9th, 2021. 6.9 Waste Services Supplemental Capital Budget Adjustment. 6.10 Multi-Unit Strategy. 9.1 Organics Processing Update Private.
Any discussion? Then please vote.
We have all the votes.
And that's passed. All right. I wanted to follow up a little bit, and I realize this is touchy territory, as it was for Mr. Beckett, but I do sort of understand the principle. I just want to think it through a little bit more around the bonuses question, because it strikes me that there could be bonuses for two different things. There could be bonuses that are in the interest of the ratepayer, which would be efficiency bonuses, or there could be bonuses, changing my hat, that benefit the shareholder. And I think that, and ironically, the bonuses that benefit the shareholder, which have more to do with rate of return and all those kind of things, it's the ratepayer that's going to pay for them. So I don't know how I'm not sure how to resolve that one, but I think it's worth a little bit more discussion. And I don't know how I'm just intrigued by the thought of that, because and I'm guessing it's both. I'm guessing the bonuses are based in both, and I don't really want to know. But I think that's the problem we're up against here, and I wonder if somebody wants to take a crack at that.
So if I could make one suggestion, Councillor. I can tell you that within EPCOR, each of our business units have operating plans with metrics associated that we want to achieve throughout the year. They are published business plans, and I will just tell you here that the staff within EPCOR, our performance management system includes us achieving the metrics on our business plan. Those business plans, as I said, are not secret. They are published, and in fact, they are up on the wall in our facilities, so our staff know what they are as well. And one thing I could suggest is that, I think we would have no problem providing you with the business plans that are published, that our staff work towards, with those metrics identified on them.
I think it would, I think it's a kind of due diligence piece that, I realize it's never going to answer this question completely, and that would be inappropriate for us to ask that question in greater detail. And I realize it puts all of you in a very difficult position. But I think, if we could have more information on that, just to do our due diligence, that would be helpful.
Happy to do so.
Hi, Councillor Henderson.
Yeah.
I haven't been able to click on, but you and Councillor Walters have been doing so great. But
okay.
I'm just wondering if
Well,
Mr.
why don't you click
Mr.
on and let me, if you want to click on now, I'll go to you next.
Yeah. that would be
Okay,
great.
was I out of time? Sorry, I may have been.
Oh, sorry.
It doesn't
I
matter.
thought
No, you go ahead, Council. I'll ask, I've got to figure out what my next questions would be anyway. Councillor Paquette, off you go.
Thanks. This question is for Mr. Beckett. I mean, I kind of view you as our utilities translator, and I know that for myself, this is still a little bit of Greek for me, and so I'm imagining for a lot of new councillors it is as well. So, from your perspective, I don't know why I'm getting all this feedback. From your perspective, I'm just wondering if you wouldn't mind summing up for us sort of the key points that you've heard so far that you feel maybe we should be keeping under consideration out of this conversation that's arisen. I don't know if that's me. I'm so sorry. I hope you heard my question.
Yeah, we heard the question. I think we should be all right.
Everything's good at this end.
Mr. Beckett, did you hear the question?
Yes, I did. So
Great.
you were after a bit of a sense of the hot topics, the items that the utility committee should be focused on?
Yeah, I know you already gave your earlier presentation in the 4 items there, but I'm just wondering if, like, just out of the conversation that's arisen now, you know, I've been following along, but to be perfectly frank, I still have at times a little bit of challenge weighing the relative importance of each thing that we're asking, and so just to have you sort of reorient would be really helpful.
Well, to rank them by way of priority, I think the top topic is return on equity, the rate of return on equity, whether EPCOR Water Services Inc. should continue to be an outlier among all utilities in Alberta, or whether they should be treated in a manner similar to the way the AUC treats all those other utilities, which would imply a rate of return equal to the generic rate of return. Recognizing that EPCOR has made some points around business risks, then there has to be some adjustments to their business risks, as the AUC has done for ATCO Gas and some of the other utilities, to give them an opportunity to earn a fair return. The one that has been discussed most often is a deferral account. In my question to EPCOR, I suggested, or I floated the possibility of a deferral account for variable revenue, $500,000 above or below forecast for each of water services, wastewater treatment, and drainage services. But there's a number of ways you can skin that cat. And if I had to say those are the top issues, I'd stop at that point. I think those are the big ticket issues that the utility committee is going to have to deal with.
Okay, that helps my focus. Thank you. I'm done.
Great, thank you. Councillor McKean.
Yeah, Councillor Paquette sort of stole my thunder, but I'm gonna continue on anyways. Mr. Beckett, you're recommending these deferral accounts, which I don't have a deep understanding, but I think I understand. There's sort of reserves that would protect the company or the corporation during low revenue years, and they would fill it back up in high revenue years. Is that sort of it?
No, it would allow the company to earn their forecasted revenue with a maximum variance of $500,000, either above or below. If it exceeded that cap, the $500,000, then that amount would be collected from or refunded to customers in a subsequent year, which means that there's protection there for the utility, but there's also protection for the customers in that they're not exposed to what has shown itself to be a very significant risk associated with consumption forecasts.
So, and yet EPCOR argues, Mr. Beckett, that would take away some of the incentive to find efficiencies or to make up for that in other parts of their lines of business. Do you understand that argument?
I understand it. I don't necessarily agree with it. I think that by setting up a deferral account with a collar, the $500,000 plus or minus, you still leave significant room there for efficiency improvements. And I think the one thing I've observed through this process is that EPCOR is very focused on achieving the highest possible rate of return that they can. And the highest possible rate of return that they can get would be achieved by achieving additional efficiencies, and that would be great.
Yeah, that's the way I would take it too. So can you help me? I'm just trying to figure out how I can reconcile your questions about the return on equity, the AUC one versus the EPCOR one, and EPCOR is arguing that they have higher business risk than the electric and gas utilities. Please give me your thoughts on that.
Well, the way the AUC deals with that is if you have higher business risks, they increase your equity ratio. So ATCO Gas, for instance, I think has an equity ratio of 35%. EPCOR in these applications has a higher equity ratio of 40%. So the higher equity ratio means that they have the opportunity to earn more at the generic rate of return.
I think that helped. Thank you very much.
I hope it helps.
Councillor Walters.
Thanks. So to stay with you, Mr. Beckett, in your submission, you talked about the 4 options that this committee has as regulator, which is to accept the applications, accept them with amendments, and reject them. I'm sort of just looking at the third one here, or the what you're essentially suggesting is, just give me 1 second, or the third one is require a refiling of the application. I presume based on the conversation today, you're suggesting the second bullet, approve the application with adjustments quantified by the regulator. Is that fair? Is that correct?
Well, I can't read the minds of the utility committee. I don't know if you're comfortable with directing some adjustments or if you need additional input from EPCOR, which you would get through requesting a refiling.
Okay. So it's one of those two, though. So we don't want to accept it as submitted, is what you're saying, is your advice to us, nor are we rejecting it outright.
That would be my advice, yes.
So then I guess the question is, on those two things, on the deferral counts and the adjustments to the rate of return, maybe I would need some help on, the chair could weigh in, or the clerk, on the process of doing that then. Because we have, this goes to council in August.
August 16th.
So
It's scheduled for that at the moment.
And there's nothing between now and then?
Well,
other than the overflow date that we just set up for. I guess I'm just putting out there for us to consider if we want to make those adjustments that Mr. Beckett's suggesting. I'm not quite sure. I forget how we did this last time. What is the process?
I think you're going to require a compliance filing anyway, because EPCOR has agreed to certain adjustments.
Right.
So that'll have to be reflected in a compliance filing.
And then that just screws all those adjustments up with the main application.
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
That would then true up all the adjustments with the actual application with the
Yes.
with the rate filing.
Yes, yeah, it would move the rate filing to incorporate those adjustments.
And then that would happen. So I don't know if this is a Mr. Beckett question or a Mr. Clerk question. That would happen then all on August 16th, but that's a council meeting, not a utility meeting.
That is currently the timing of it. We do have another utility committee meeting scheduled, I think, in August. And that we could look at that as another option. It just, we need to get this to council in enough time to pass it before council rises.
Right. So then maybe our course of action today is to ask for the compliance filing with certain direction to make certain adjustments, and then that would come back to the, is that, Mr. Clerk, is that utility committee meeting before the council meeting?
There's a utility committee meeting on the 27th of August.
So it's
And the last council meeting, I believe, is on the 5th.
Of September.
Yes.
If I could just jump in here, I think if the compliance filing, however, is compliant with everything we ask here, it probably could go straight to council.
Yeah.
It's only if for some reason EPCOR said no, that we need to talk about this again.
Well, but we are the regulator, and so I guess what we need to have. So maybe then the next step is we need and there was some stuff that administration had recommended as well. So is there a motion that can be drafted that asks for the compliance, like refers this to that council meeting, asks for the compliance filing, and it all lands onto the council agenda, and we can deal with it there.
Well, anybody could make a motion at any time, and would, if you
I
would, then we
understand
could,
that. There's got to be
discuss it
one
from there.
in opera, I presume. But there's the motion in the reports, but if we're amending those motions to include the compliance filing, there needs to be some direction associated with that.
I agree. So would you like some aid in putting that together as a motion?
Yeah, so
Okay.
I don't know if the clerks and admin and EPCOR need some time to draft that. I certainly am not prepared to draft it on the fly.
No, understood, and I think we'd want to have some discussion of it, because I'm not sure, I don't want to take it as a given that we would necessarily support all the recommendations.
Oh, we need a straw dog start here.
Understood, yep.
Okay.
I'm not sure, well, I suppose maybe the clerk could work, so you're proposing as a straw dog, putting Mr. Beckett's recommendations on the table?
Yes.
For a compliance filing?
Yeah, and then we can talk about that. Like, I'm not even.
I'm not convinced. I think I'm absolutely supportive of some. I have some questions about some of the others. So,
yeah, I'm the same. I'm not there yet either, but I think we need to see something.
Okay.
That we can add.
Well,
specific.
maybe I may ask then, and we'll go on to other questions. I'll ask if the clerk can work with Mr. Beckett to come up with some wording that we can get back to you.
Right, it's just start to narrow.
Yep, no, absolutely fair enough. Okay,
Okay.
I have a few more sort of smaller questions though that I'd like to ask, aside from that. And so one of them sort of leads into it. And I'm completely supportive of the One Water, but it does really feel to me here that we're doing 3 PBRs for something that you're really getting very close to treating as one utility. And I think that makes perfect sense. But it raises an interesting challenge, I think, for us, because I think the risks are different between the 3 different utilities. If we take the point, for instance, that contributed assets are one of your risks, there are no contributed assets that I'm aware of that go with wastewater, very little. It's radically different, right? So And I understand that you're thinking of it as one, but we're being challenged with 3 different PBRs that actually have very different parameters. 2 of them are 3 years, 1 of them is 5 years. It's a very different risk profile. And I just wouldn't mind your thinking back on that, and it may speak to how we deal with this, how council chooses to deal with this in the future, that it really feels to me that you're now, I mean, you talked about you know, the capital focus going on one rather than another. That suggests to me that you're beginning to think of them as one utility. And I'm wondering how to reconcile that, because I think that's part of the problem here in terms of some of these risk pieces, is the risks are very different in the 3 utilities.
So if you look at the $1.35 billion we're going to invest in the utility over the next 3 or 5 years, depending on what part of the business you look at, and how we're managing those risks, we've decreased the spending in water by $150 million compared to the last PBR. That's $430 million remain, and that will be spent over 5 years, so just a little south of $100 million a year. On the wastewater side of things, we're going to spend about $55 million per year over the next 3 years, and that's consistent with the level of investment we've made over the last, say, 10 years. And that's a requirement of us continuing to get in front of the demands of that facility. It's an aging plant. When you look at drainage, drainage accounts for over half of the capital investment. We're investing $750 million in drainage in 3 years. And that's reflected to the risk that we see in that utility. And when you split the $750 million, $370 million is to continue just base operations. So it's over $120 million a year of capital investment just to continue to provide that safe, reliable drainage and stormwater service. And then we are moving forward and continuing to fund SERP and CORE, and that investment will be over $380 million in the next 3 years. So we approach the spend of capital looking at it as one water utility, but we assign the capital and the dollars where the need is most based off of risk. So we feel that we have gotten in front of some of the bigger challenges in water. Now we're trying to time when growth will occur, when plant expansion needs to happen. If you look at our main break history, the number of main breaks that we've seen in our distribution system have reduced dramatically. That's because we've aggressively attacked the aging cast iron infrastructure. So we're backing off on that a bit because there's less risk there, and we're moderating the increase. But we're placing additional capital in drainage because that's where all the risk is in our business.
I understand that, and that makes perfect sense to me. The problem for us as a regulator is we're now being asked to understand risk and set a premium based on risk, based on the whole package, because I think that's the way you're thinking about it. When in actual fact, you know, we can't think of the risks as part of a whole package because the risks are very different in each different part of the package. If we're dealing with this premium piece, they're not the same risks for the 3 different utilities. And I think in terms of, you know, I think that's part of our struggle here. And maybe, maybe we need to, if you're thinking of this as a whole, you know, we may have to, as a regulator, begin to respond to it as a whole, but it's not being presented to us that way right now. So I just raise it. I don't know the answer to this problem, but it does seem to me that's, you know, it strikes me that that's part of where the disconnect is here, is that you're thinking of it as a whole, you're thinking of the risk profiles as a whole across all 3. And yet it's not being presented to us as all 3. It's being presented to us as 3 different PBRs.
So Councillor Henderson, I don't know if this is helpful or not, but I think, you know, when we've been talking about things like the prioritization of capital, we have looked at it as a whole, because we know that customers, when they look at their bill, they don't care if the increase comes from water or wastewater or drainage. And so that's why we've looked at it as a whole. I would say, you know, my perspective on some of the risks is we've looked at it more as an average. We've looked at, and even some of the tables that were presented on what's the percentage of contributed assets. We recognize that drainage is different than wastewater, is different than water. And so we presented the information as here's what each one is, and here's the average of the 3. And I think that's kind of the approach that we've taken on each of the different items. Some of the differences are one time. The 3-year versus 5-year, I think, is a one-time difference. And our intention had been to come back in the next PBR and combine, as we talked about, drainage and wastewater treatment. You know, in which case we would look at it as one bucket. But I think the rest of the question is fair. I don't know that any of us have a great answer to
No,
it.
but I think as we look at the motion that's coming forward, I think we
Yep.
have to keep this in the back of our mind. I have one other little thing before we get to Councillor Walter's motion, which probably, I mean, I do have some other questions, but for the sake of everybody's patience. I was interested, in the RNG project at Gold Bar. Because it does, there's some linked capital projects to that, but it doesn't show up as a capital project. And there actually is mention there that it's going to be carved out and is not part of the utility's concern in terms of the capital project, but the feedstock belongs to the utility. And when we deal with the feedstock, for instance, with the composting, with the biosolids, the utility is getting credit for that feedstock. So I wanted to just say out loud that I'm not entirely convinced. I'd want to see a business case to understand that piece of the puzzle, because I'm not entirely convinced that the utilities should not have interest in that RNG project, because without their feedstock, there is no RNG project. So I think that would have to be dealt with somehow, and I just wanted to ask that out loud, because I felt if I didn't, it's going to be taken as a given, and I just wanted to get your thinking on that.
Sorry, can't turn on the microphone. It's a good, that's an interesting question. I think right now we're using some of the biogas, and it's not RNG or natural gas. It's dirty biogas.
No, gotcha.
We're using that to heat our boilers, so there is a direct benefit to the utility. And then the excess gas we flare off.
Yep.
When we move to an RNG project, we're actually going to be lowering our operating cost, because we're going to be getting, through the investment of that capital that's non-regulated, we're going to be getting a cleaner gas. And in some instances, we're going to actually supplant the dirty biogas with natural gas, and we're going to actually lower our operating costs.
No, I understand all that. I just was a little bit concerned in the comment that that's in the PBR that these two things are separate, and that the utility has no interest in that question of what happens with the RNG. And I that may well be where it lands, but I don't think it should be a given, and that's why I wanted to ask the question out loud.
I believe we're held whole, but we can confirm that for you.
Yeah, because it does say in here that they're separate. The
They're
PBR
definitely
makes mention of it, and I just want to flag it, because if we don't flag it here, it becomes the truth, right? So,
Right.
Yeah.
Fair
okay.
enough.
All
Yes,
right.
Councillor, we are held whole. The RNG project would pay the regulated utility compensation for our increased consumption of natural gas, because they will be using 100% of our biogas to clean and inject into the grid.
Right.
And they would also pay us for other services, like use of a pipe rack to carry their piping and things
Yep.
of that nature.
No, fair enough. It's just the principle that I'm questioning here. I don't really, I know there's a lot more work to be done on that. I just wanted to question the principle that they're separate, that's all, and that just felt that needed to be explored more at the time. So I'm seriously out of time again, and I'm guessing Councillor Walters has his motion ready to go.
Well, I don't.
Okay.
We are still working on the motion.
All right, we're still
thank
working
you.
on the motion. I had a few other little questions while we're waiting for it then, if nobody else has any.
I did want to ask.
Yeah.
Sorry, Ben, if I.
No, go for it.
So, Mr. Beckett, when you talked about used a couple terms in terms of the rate of return and not leaning so heavily on the risk premium, but there was two things you said: equity thickness, and I think related to various other regulatory strategies to bring down costs to shore up the rate of return. Can you just dig into those a little bit more so I understand what you mean, particularly by equity thickness and what some of those strategies might be?
Equity thickness is a techie term for how much debt, how much equity is in the utility. Right. So what the AUC has done is, for utilities that have more inherent business risks, they have increased the equity component, which increases the utility company's earnings. And that's their way of compensating the utilities for the increased risk. EPCOR's equity is already on the high side of, I think it's the highest of the utilities in Alberta, and so that reflects increased risk on their part.
Okay.
Increased risk on their part.
And, so, what the AUC has done is, for utilities that have more inherent business risks, they have increased the equity component, which increases the utility company's earnings. Okay. And then when you're talking about strategies, employing other regulatory strategy to help shore up the rate of return, you're essentially talking about, you know, efficiencies and or reducing capital costs. Maybe say a little bit more about that.
No, what I'm talking about there is deferral accounts.
Okay.
And rate design.
Okay.
Both of those
Okay.
can be used to manage risk.
Okay. I think that is about all I had. Okay. I think I'm good, Ben.
Just a few more questions while we're waiting. I was interested because I understand the spike up in Gobar in the wastewater piece is because it's taking on the biosolids. So that makes sense to me. What I didn't see, and maybe I just wasn't seeing it, is a corresponding spike down in drainage, right? Which should be there. I mean, I understand we've trued up, we true up between our taxes on the fire, which makes sense on the water. Well, it doesn't perfectly true up because you probably were going to come back and ask us for more money in the contract. So, but nevertheless, I'm not, that should be a wash on the two.
I can
and yet
confirm for you that there is a 100% corresponding reduction in drainage. And if you'd like, I can point you to where you can find that in the application after this meeting.
Sure, but it's not spiking down though. And so, we're not seeing a large drop in year one on drainage. Now, is that because they're proportionally different sized utilities?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, they are very, very different in size.
Okay. All right. I just wanted to track that because I didn't have time to go back and work it through myself. And then two other questions. One of the things I think that was raised by administration was this question of if we're deferring maintenance, if we're deferring capital projects, what assurance, and I think probably we're protected by the performance side of things, but what confidence we can have that we're just not pushing costs off to the future. Because I think, and the reason the administration asked that question is because the city is very, very aware of this with our own infrastructure, that we not do that. And I think we need a kind of, some confidence that that's not what's happening here, particularly in the water side, by pushing off capital projects.
No, it's 100% not happening. And again, it's that risk-based approach. Mark Mathon spoke to it a bit earlier in one of the questions. We've gotten a lot of good information over the last 10 to 15 years in investing our capital, whether it's neighborhood renewal programs, cast iron main replacements. And we feel very confident that we've got a good handle on the condition of our assets, and we're able to be a bit more surgical in where we place capital and when we place it. We do not feel by any stretch of the imagination we're deferring or pushing things out. We think we're right-sizing our level of investment to match the risk that we're seeing out in the system. And in some of our recent neighborhood renewal programs, we were pulling infrastructure out that we could probably argue, if we wanted to, that there might have been some life left in those pipe. And we think that there's dollars better spent elsewhere. And again, by being a bit more surgical in our placement of capital in water, it's allowed us to, and it's afforded us the opportunity to place more capital in drainage where we certainly believe it's needed.
And then thank you for that. My one final question was, in the Grant Thornton report, there is a suggestion in terms of future work that needs to be done, that we should be truing up on the performance side better to what, in actual fact, EPCOR has been doing. That there's a large gap in a lot of cases between historic performance and the targets you've actually been meeting, which, when we get into the bonusing side of the equation, can skew what's actually happening here. And it's probably future work. It's probably stuff I don't know if it'd be possible to do right now. But I don't know if Grant Thornton wants to speak to that. It wasn't part of their presentation today, but it is part of their report, if the Grant Thornton people are still on the line.
Yeah, we're here, Councillor Henderson. And are you referring to the performance metrics?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I might ask my colleague Angie Brown if she's still on the phone to speak to that.
Sure, I'm still here. So I guess, Councillor, I believe this is probably something that needs to be undertaken through a future process, because I just don't think you're going to have the time to deal with this, because it is a pretty weighty issue. But basically, what our point was is that in EPCOR's evidence, they had supplied kind of some of their historical information on each of their indices, and then adjustments to those. But absent sort of a peer group to benchmark against or continued focus on improvement to those metrics over time, you're left with a gap between what they're actually achieving and the target. And because of the way that the bonus points are allocated between a specific band of those performance measures, there is the option that overperforming in one area could offset lesser performance in another area. So our recommendation was really just that this warrants further analysis and discussion and thoughts, because we could see this delta sort of evolving over time.
So that's something we should probably flag as a kind of for the next PBR. Work
Yes,
that
I
needs to be
believe
done
so.
between. Great, thanks. Those are all my questions. Do we have the motion?
If I could just ask Mr. McNabb if the, are the final edits done? Sure, go for it. Okay, so MJ,
I mean,
could you
we'll
put
work
this on the
so
board,
it's a
please?
starting place. We'll ask some questions about it once it's out there.
So we will display it in just a moment. And we may need Mr. Beckett to pipe in because he hasn't seen the final
Fair
motion.
enough, and
Thank you.
understanding, you know, that this is something for us to work from is the primarily.
Excuse me, Mr. Chair? May I just ask a quick question? The way the meeting was going to flow, from what we understood, is we were going to get an opportunity to speak about all the issues that were raised?
And absolutely.
Is that before or after this?
Well, I think you're probably right. I think probably we should do it before, but I think the hope is by putting the motion on the table, we can now ask some specific questions about the motion.
Fair enough, thank you.
So your point is well taken. Before we vote on this, we'll come back to you. All right.
Sorry, just Denis, the 2 and 3 beside the A and B, we should blow away, so there's 3 points.
Okay.
So it's 1 A and B. And the
Correct.
4,
There
so
should
I think
be
it's just
1 A and B, number 2, number 3, and number 4. If Ms. de Guzman can correct that, please. Thank you.
I'm just trying to get it somewhere where I can read it. So. Okay, I have some questions about it and some things we may want to add, but I think it's a starting place. So, Councillor Walters?
You just want me to read it in?
Sure. Or move it, whichever. You probably should read it in for those playing along at home. I'm sure there are hundreds of them.
Yeah, point of privilege, Mr. Chair, we can't see the whole motion at home.
Oh yeah, there it is. It was there.
But
Now it's not.
I think if you have your eScribe open and you press, and you pick view casted motion, you should be able to see it.
Yeah, that works sometimes. Oh, there we go. That says allow Beckett to finish. We've already dealt with that. I don't think he's far from finished. Okay. There, oh. You could just zoom that out again, Denny, or whoever's running that.
Do you want me to read it in for you? Because I can, if that would be helpful, and you can still move it.
Yeah, either way.
Okay, I'll
you can read it.
The administration worked with EPCOR to bring forward amendments to the applicable schedules to EPCOR Water Services Bylaw 19626 and EPCOR Drainage Services and Waste Water Treatment Bylaw 19627 to reflect the following. 1, the following adjustments as noticed by Edmonton Water and, I can't remember what EWSI stands for, Edmonton, whatever, EWSI in its response to City of Edmonton PBR review reports, page 6, attachment 3, FCS 00627 be reflected in the compliance applications. A, 3.7 million for reduced debt costs, and B, 5.2 million to, and hang on, it went away, 5.2 million to reimburse customers related to the capitalization of valve casings and service box replacements. 2, a deferral account for variable revenue for each of water services, wastewater treatment, and drainage services that would apply to revenue variances of 500,000 or more per year, either higher or lower. 3, a return on equity for water services for 2022 to 26 and for wastewater treatment from 2022 to 2024 of 8.5% based on the Alberta Utilities Commission's generic rate of return with no change to the requested return on equity for drainage services contained in the rates. And 4, an efficiency factor for drainage services for the 2022-2024 performance-based, and that's where I can't read anymore, but I think it references 0.5,
yes.
the 0.5% efficiency factor, 0.5% efficiency, based on a 0.5% efficiency factor. So that's what's there, and we can now, if that's what you're prepared to move, it gives us a place to start in terms of discussion.
Yeah, I'll just put it on the, I'll move it.
All right, questions?
Do we want EPCOR to respond now? I think that would be in order.
Well, I have a few questions about things we may still want to add to this, and I do have some questions about whether or not I'm prepared to support all of this. What I'm not seeing in here is any reference to the deferral accounts on the NRAs. So I don't know if either that was I think Mr. Beckett and or administration, whoever would like to respond to that.
Well, I can respond from my perspective. I think that EPCOR has been put on warning that they need to be much more careful about how they treat these NRAs in the future. I'm a little sensitive to the argument that going back to the previous NRAs would be like changing the rules in the middle of the game, retroactive rate making, and I would never feel comfortable supporting that. But I think it's important that EPCOR realizes that these kind of issues, overestimating the cost of an NRA or getting approval for an NRA and then postponing the work to a subsequent period are issues that are of significant concern to the Utility Committee. And I think by being put on notice, we can expect better results in the future. But
so we may need to do that as a subsequent, in terms of instructions for the next PBR?
Yes, that
okay.
would be.
Mr. McNabb, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. We're not meaning to change the rules of the game, and I know that was a difficult one. I think from administration, we just feel very strongly these NRAs should be based on actual costs going forward. If we use forecast costs, administration is going to have to, and Utility Committee, take a lot longer and ask a lot more questions about the dollars that are being requested when time is often the essence when EPCOR brings these forward. So as long as there's clarity going forward, if Utility Committee agrees, NRAs should be based on actual costs.
Okay. Well, then I will flag, I think we need to flag that, Mr. Clerk, that we will probably have some instructions for the next PBR at the end of this process, so we need to make that part of that. I think there were some others as well that we would need to flag in there. Great. Okay. Those were my questions. Does anybody else have any questions for what's in here before we ask for EPCOR's response? All right.
Oh, sorry.
Yep.
Again, I can't
Councillor
click on
Paquette.
for some reason.
Yep.
I can see it on my screen, but it's a little bit blurry. I'm just wondering, is there any way to see it in eScribe? I mean, I know what it is, but I just, you know.
It should be in eScribe if you press the, oh, it's vanished though. We're not seeing the casted motion in eScribe anymore.
You know, I'll probably just have to restart eScribe. I can
Oh,
muddle
there it
through on
is.
the screen.
It should be flashing now.
Oh,
for
actually,
casted motion.
whoever did that
Yeah.
just now, actually helped. Okay, I'm good. Sorry about that, Councillor Henderson.
Okay. Over to EPCOR. If this makes sense for you to respond at this point, or, I mean, or we can continue to do it through questions?
Yeah, I think at this point, we would need some time to evaluate these. These are substantive changes. And I don't think we'd be prepared today to opine on this. We'd be certainly happy to answer any questions that anyone may have, but I think we'd like some time to model this and better understand the impact
No,
this
fair
has
enough,
on our
and we're
business.
back, you know, we do have the opportunity,
Can
fortunately,
we-
unfortunately, to come back on the 5th, so.
And can we,
Yep.
on the 9th, so is this something, is it based on this? Is it wise for us to refer this to the 9th? Because the way stuff, we have that whole day.
Yeah, well, I don't think we need to refer it to the 9th. I think we could just adjourn and continue this then. I don't
Okay,
think it
yeah,
needs to be
that's fine then.
referred. Yeah, but I think there might be some value in asking some questions right now. And allowing EPCOR a chance to respond later if people need clarity on these and what the impacts would be. We could certainly go that route. We've got half an hour. So if that helps clear some questions out of the way, that, I think.
Okay, well, I'll ask a couple questions then, if that's okay. Just, Mr. Bradley, or, just general response to this motion. I know you want more time to give a detailed response, but, you can take my 5 minutes here to kind of, or anybody from EPCOR.
Yeah, I'd be happy to start the conversation. I think the concern we have moving in this direction is the AUC does not regulate a utility that's like EPCOR. We're a water utility. They regulate primarily natural gas and electric utilities that wheel electricity and natural gas through their system. They don't have the risk of producing the product, treating its residual, and then the health and environmental standards that we're held to are completely different, in our opinion, than what we see in the regulated natural gas and electric utilities. So to look at us on a peer-to-peer basis at 8.5%, we had filed an IR last night based on some questions we received from administration last week about some of the additional changes we would need to see to our structure, whether it's contributed assets, the rate design, and other factors that would need to be adjusted to then truly compare us apples to apples to a regulated utility at the AUC. And I think it's important to note that city administration, Grant Thornton, and the company have clearly articulated that there's a risk premium above 8.5. Now, it's subjective what that is. Is it 150 basis points? Is it 175 basis points? I think that's really the question that we're trying to answer here today. But it's clear that our risks are materially greater than utilities that are regulated by the AUC. So if we move in this direction, that will foundationally change our business. And we have concerns with our ability to continue to issue low-cost debt financing. When you look at the AUC in context, it provides the second lowest returns in the country. When you compare the AUC, generic cost of capital, to other utilities across North America, it is at the bottom. And that puts considerable pressure on regulated utilities to maintain reasonable credit ratings. And just last week, NMAX was put on a credit watch, and they may drop below investment grade. And one of the factors the credit rating agencies noted was that the low returns that they're receiving from the AUC is part of the generic cost of capital. So again, we'll have to evaluate and model how this impacts our revenues. This is something that we haven't evaluated. I think we were here prepared to talk about the risk above 8.5. But if we want to move in a direction towards 8.5, it's just going to take us some time. That's more of a statement than an answer. I apologize.
We did name this a straw dog, so I don't want us to get too, I want us to start, fine tuning where we're going to land. I'm grateful that we have this time on the 9th, and some time, and then some good time in between. Now that this is in front of us as the adjustments that we'll make to the application. So this is some version of it. I would, but on the deferral account piece, maybe just respond to that. Number 2 in the motion.
Yeah, on the deferral account piece, I think you could argue that you're de-risking our business by moving and entering into a deferral account mechanism. Typically, the business asks for the deferral account, and in exchange for receiving the deferral account, there's a reduction in their returns. We're not asking for any type of deferral here. We feel we've demonstrated a strong ability to manage our risk going forward, and we feel confident that we can continue to do that. If you look historically at our earned ROE versus what was awarded, we've consistently come in around target. We have not distorted it and over-earned significantly or under-earned significantly. I think the PBR process has provided the necessary balance that at the end of the day protects customers and provides that rate stability. We would need to look at what type of risk does this deferral mechanism offload from the business, and it could be fairly arbitrary. We could feel it's 25 basis points of risk deferral, and the utility advisor could think it's 50, and utility committee could think it's 75. That's why one of the things we talked about at the beginning is if we wanted to move towards deferral mechanisms, and that's certainly something we can do, and as the regulator, you can instruct us to look at those. Again, those are better done in a study offline, and I also think it's incredibly important that we get our customers' input because their rate stability could come at risk. We could have a year where consumption was way up and they see a huge decrease, and then there could be a year where consumption was way down and there's a huge swing back the other way. So again, we'll do our best to evaluate this between now and the 9th, but those are just a few things that come up. They're not a bad idea, but it's all about the context and it's all about the controls. And then I really think it's important to get feedback from customers. Is this something they want to see?
Okay, thanks. I'm out of time, but Councillor Henderson, I do just, if I may, think that this is good that we do have some time between now and then.
No, absolutely.
This will be the final motion that we vote on. But I'm grateful that we have a more narrow focus here in terms of what adjustments we will make to the application.
Well, maybe, in that light, I want to ask a couple of questions just so we wrap our minds around what the change shifts are. Maybe I'll ask Mr. Beckett this question, because as I understand this, quite apart from whether or not we go with AUC or whether we recognize that there's some risk profile, part of the risk that's being put on the table here is this question of demand risk, particularly in terms of water, but it affects it doesn't affect drainage, but it affects wastewater. So the question is, who takes that risk? And so the option that would be in front of us here, understanding we haven't necessarily quantified what that risk is in terms of rate of return. So we can either as regulators or as ratepayers, we can either take the risk by giving a greater rate of return, in which case we're not taking risk but we're paying more, or we can say we'll take that risk on by taking this unknown that is out of EPCOR's control and saying we'll take that risk instead. So it's really about whether or not where we're prepared to take the risk. Well, there is no risk if it's in the rate of return. We've bought insurance against rate shifts, correct?
And that's exactly the point. Whenever you buy insurance, you're trading uncertainty for certainty, but you're paying for it.
Yeah.
And that's the issue. You're paying for it. Somebody's making a profit out of your decision to buy that insurance. In this case, it would be EPCOR. And I just wanted to re-emphasize a point I made earlier. I don't think anybody's arguing that these utilities are more risky than electric and gas distribution utilities. What the argument seems to be about is how do you compensate for that? One way of compensating for it is a risk premium, but we've found that it's very, very difficult to calculate what that risk premium should be. The other way to compensate for it is to de-risk some aspects of the business, and you can do that with the proposed deferral account. But EPCOR keeps insisting that everybody's agreed there should be a risk premium built into the ROE, and that's not the case.
Well, and that's where I want to go next, because it seems to me that the 8.5 suggests that there is no risk premium, but I'm not sure that taking out just doing the deferral account. And I think we have debate about whether or not all the risks are real risks or not. But there were some other risks I think that everybody did accept that are not necessarily covered by this. So just your thoughts on how those two things go together.
Well, if you move forward with this, you're basically approving each and every forecast expenditure that EPCOR has made. You're approving it. You're not arguing about it. You're not reducing it. You're approving it. You're giving them everything they've asked for, and that should be sufficient for them to operate, maintain, and improve their facilities. So I think you've given them the regulatory backstop by approving their forecasts.
So that would suggest that on things like water safety and those kind of things, or change in regulation, that should already be built into their thinking. And if they've got that right, that should be part of the return. That's not a risk that we should be paying extra for.
You stated that very succinctly, and I agree with everything you just said.
All right. Well, we'll be interested to see what EPCOR's response to that is. Okay, that helps me understand what's before us, and it's going to be an interesting discussion, I suspect. So, anybody else? And please, I know we're getting tired, but if there is stuff, I recognize, this takes a lot to wrap our minds around. So please, for those of you, if there's anything that's still confusing you about this would be a great chance to ask those questions. There are no stupid questions with this stuff. It's, we're playing with millions of dollars here, so.
So I'll jump in if I could. Mr. Chair?
Absolutely.
So part of the onus on us as the regulator, and I'll have the language wrong, but to keep the company, the corporation whole, functioning. And so EPCOR's argument seems to be that this would degrade that. And I'm just wondering, Mr. Beckett, I guess you feel we've found the balance in this motion. EPCOR is going to come back and say the ROE is not enough. They've already mentioned the contributed assets and some of the other issues. The fact that they haven't gone sort of full rate yet on drainage. I hear those arguments, and I'm a little concerned that we could trim too hard. But I think EPCOR is going to come back with a response to us for June 9th, so I won't ask them that. But tell me about how you weigh that balance about ratepayers versus keeping the utility whole.
Well, I start from the perspective that the Alberta Utilities Commission is a reasonable, competent regulator, and I have no reason to question the process that they used to get to the results that they got to. I suspect that when EPCOR comes back, they're going to focus most of their response on the possible impact that these changes might have on their debt rating. In my mind, that's something that can be addressed in subsequent PBR periods. The impact of they'll have to tell us what they think the impact of a degradation of debt impact will be, but that seems to be the major issue that the Utility Committee will be dealing with going forward.
Okay, I just wanted to try to get your take on that, and I appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Councillor Banga.
Thank you. I only got one question that is for Mr. Beckett there. My question is about, I guess, part 2 or point 2 of the motion, deferral account for variable revenue for all these wastewater water services and drainage. That could apply to revenue variances of. Could you help me understand this portion? What are we asking here?
Sure. So these utilities basically charge two different rates. A fixed rate, which is compensation for them being there ready to serve you as a customer, and a variable rate that usually is meant to reflect the incremental cost of providing another liter of water or whatever the product is. So it's that variable component of their rates, which they've told us is set much lower than their actual cost of service, but it's the variable component of the rates that would be subject to the deferral account. It would not affect their fixed rates. It would only affect the portion of rates that is collected through the variable component. And the idea of the $500,000 collar is that it creates a dead zone in which EPCOR can focus on improvements of efficiency, but above or below that collar, it protects EPCOR and it also protects customers.
Okay, and so if I'm looking, let's say, at my EPCOR bill in relation to these three items, then what would it tell me? Like where would it show me that, you know, with this, something is going to improve for the consumer?
You know, I was thinking as I was driving here, I should have brought a copy of my EPCOR bill because I thought this sort of question might come up. But if you look on the bill, anytime you see a multiplication, so many liters of water, that's the variable component. Anytime you see just a fixed cost that doesn't vary with consumption, that's the fixed cost.
Okay. No, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. We don't need to keep on going needlessly here, so I'm not seeing anybody else on the board. So thanks, everybody, for a very intense day. And at this point, I would suggest, why don't we, maybe a motion would be in order to postpone this until the 5th.
So moved.
Postpone or yeah, nothing's going to change in the reports, so I think postpone is appropriate. So it's moved. Any concerns or worries about that? If not, then let's please vote. There it is.
And we have all the votes.
And display the vote, please. And strangely enough, that's passed. Well, thanks, everybody. And sorry that we have to bring you all back on the 5th, but I think probably that's going to be useful time, or on the 9th, rather.
9th.
Yep. I think actually probably in retrospect that's going to be useful, and we'll be able to start with a much clearer idea of where we're going on the 9th. And in the
Thanks,
meantime,
everybody.
it's a nice, lovely day, I think, outside. Not that I can say for sure. So please go out and enjoy it and recover from the day.
Whatever is left.
We're adjourned. Thanks. Thanks, everyone.